The gene laboratories buried deep beneath the Himalayan mountains witnessed the Emperor's greatest work. In those subterranean vaults within the imperial palace, the master of mankind conducted experiments that would reshape human destiny. The Primarch project represented the pinnacle of genetic engineering, psychic manipulation, and biomantic craftsmanship. 20 demigods were to be created, each designed with specific attributes and purposes within the Emperor's grand design for humanity's conquest of the galaxy. Among these 20 godlike beings, the 15th Primarch stood apart. Magnus was engineered to be the most psychically potent of all his brothers, a living conduit for the warp's power tempered by discipline and understanding that the Emperor himself would provide. The Emperor crafted Magnus with deliberate intent. Where other Primarchs received enhanced strength, tactical genius, or supernatural charisma, Magnus's primary gift was his connection to the immaterium. His genetic code contained sequences that would allow him to perceive and manipulate the warp with unprecedented clarity. The Emperor envisioned Magnus as the ultimate tool in humanity's mastery of psychic power, a being who could navigate the sea of souls while remaining uncorrupted by its denizens. This was no accident of design. The Emperor understood that humanity's future would require mastery over psychers, and Magnus would serve as both weapon and teacher in this endeavor. The 15th Primarch's gestation pod contained not just biological material, but carefully woven psychic matrices that would allow his consciousness to develop in tandem with his physical form. The catastrophe that scattered the Primarchs remains one of history's darkest moments. The ruinous powers of chaos, perceiving the threat that these demigods posed to their eternal game, struck at the Emperor's work. Through the warp they reached, tearing open reality itself within the Imperial Palace laboratories. The infant Primarchs, still gestating in their pods, were ripped from Terra and hurled across the galaxy through the tides of the immaterium. Each landed on a different world, their fates determined by the whims of chaos and the currents of the warp. For Magnus, his journey ended on Prospero, a world located in the Segmentum Pacificus, far from Terra's light. Prospero was unlike most human worlds. While many planets that received the scattered Primarchs were savage or barbaric, Prospero had developed a sophisticated civilization built around psychic talent. The planet's population possessed an unusually high percentage of psychers, and rather than fear or persecute these individuals, prospering society had elevated them to positions of respect and authority. The capital city of Tizca stood as a monument to this philosophy, its towers and pyramids constructed through a combination of conventional architecture and psychic manipulation. Scholar cults dominated Prosperine culture, each dedicated to different aspects of psychic study and esoteric knowledge. These organizations maintained vast libraries, conducted experiments into the nature of the warp, and sought to catalog the various phenomena that psychers could manifest. The infant Magnus's arrival on Prospero was recorded in Prosperine legend. The scholar cults possessed prophecies speaking of a savior who would lead their people to enlightenment, a being of immense psychic power who would unlock the secrets of the universe. When Magnus emerged from his gestation pod, the psychically sensitive population of Prospero felt his presence like a beacon. He grew at an accelerated rate, as all Primarchs did, but his development was marked by an intellectual hunger that surpassed even his physical maturation. The scholar cults of Tizca recognized him immediately as the fulfillment of their ancient prophecies. Magnus's education among the Prosperine scholars shaped his worldview fundamentally. Unlike many of his brothers who were raised in warrior cultures or hostile environments, Magnus spent his formative years surrounded by teachers and knowledge seekers. The scholar cults opened their libraries to him, granting access to texts that covered every subject from physics and mathematics to philosophy and occult lore. Magnus consumed this knowledge voraciously. His psychic abilities manifested early and powerfully, allowing him to perceive truths that remained hidden from normal humans. He could read the psychic impressions left on ancient texts, communicate telepathically with his teachers, and even project his consciousness into the warp to observe its currents directly. The natives of Prospero possessed psychic abilities themselves, but Magnus's power dwarfed theirs completely. Where a skilled Prosperine psyker might move objects with their mind or communicate telepathically across short distances, Magnus could reshape reality on a fundamental level. He demonstrated abilities that the scholar cults had only theorized about in their most ambitious texts. Yet despite this overwhelming superiority, Magnus never displayed arrogance toward his adoptive people. He genuinely valued their accumulated knowledge and treated even the least powerful psyker with respect if they demonstrated intellectual curiosity and dedication to learning. The physical form that Magnus possessed marked him as extraordinary even among the Primarchs. His skin bore a deep crimson hue, not the red of blood but a richer, more vibrant shade that seemed to catch and hold light in unusual ways. This coloration was uniform across his entire body, a result of the Emperor's genetic engineering rather than any pigmentation disorder. His hair grew in thick copper-red waves, the metallic sheen of it visible even in dim light. Magnus's stature exceeded that of normal humans dramatically. Even among his Primarch brothers, who all stood head and shoulders above baseline humanity, Magnus was tall. His build combined the massive musculature common to all Primarchs with a certain litheness that suggested speed and agility despite his size. Magnus was born with 2 eyes, contrary to some later accounts that suggested his cyclopean appearance was congenital. His original eyes were striking enough, possessing an unusual depth that seemed to contain swirling colors when observed closely. Those who met his gaze often reported feeling as though Magnus could perceive their innermost thoughts and feelings, an impression that was not entirely inaccurate given his psychic abilities. The loss of one eye came later, the result of a terrible bargain made in desperation, but in his early years on Prospero, Magnus possessed the same binocular vision as any human. The scholar cults of Tyrik-Kage organized themselves into various fellowships, each pursuing different aspects of psychic knowledge. Magnus moved freely among these groups, learning from each and contributing his own insights. He studied the Corvidi, who practiced divination and prophecy. He worked with the Piri, who specialized in manipulating thermal energy through psychic means. The Pavoni taught him biomancy, the art of using psychic power to heal or alter living tissue. The Raptora focused on telekinesis and the manipulation of physical forces. The Athenians studied telepathy and mental communication. Each fellowship possessed techniques and understanding that Magnus absorbed and expanded upon. His integration into Prosperine society was remarkably smooth. Unlike some Primarchs who conquered their adopted worlds through force of arms, Magnus ascended to leadership through demonstrated wisdom and psychic mastery. The scholar cults recognized his superiority not as a threat, but as validation of their entire philosophical approach. Here was living proof that psychic power, properly studied and applied, could elevate humanity to heights previously unimagined. Magnus became not just their leader but their greatest teacher, sharing insights that revolutionized Prosperine understanding of the warp and psychic phenomena. Prospero itself flourished under Magnus's guidance. The planet's cities expanded, with new structures raised through combinations of conventional construction and psychic manipulation. The libraries of Tyrik-Kage grew to contain the most comprehensive collection of esoteric knowledge in the galaxy outside of Terra itself. Magnus encouraged exploration and experimentation, pushing the boundaries of what psychers believed possible. He also instituted certain safeguards, recognizing dangers in the warp that even the experienced Prosperine scholars had failed to fully appreciate. His own explorations of the Immaterium had shown him entities and phenomena that posed genuine threats to unwary psychers. The 15th Primarch's reputation spread beyond Prospero. Other worlds in the Segmentum Pacificus heard tales of the Crimson Giant who commanded powers beyond mortal understanding. Some sent emissaries seeking knowledge or alliance. Others viewed Prospero with suspicion, fearing the concentration of psychic power that Magnus represented. Magnus himself remained focused on his studies, driven by an insatiable need to understand the fundamental nature of reality and humanity's place within it. He conducted experiments that would have been impossible for lesser psychers, projecting his consciousness deep into the warp to observe its structure and inhabitants. The planet Prospero occupied a peculiar position in the galaxy, both geographically and culturally. Located in the Segmentum Pacificus, far from the light of Terra and the centers of human civilization that would eventually form the Imperium, Prospero had developed in isolation during the Age of Strife. While most human worlds descended into barbarism, or were consumed by Xeno's predation during that dark period, Prospero's unusual demographics allowed it to chart a different course. The planet's population contained an abnormally high percentage of psychers, individuals whose genetic makeup allowed them to perceive and manipulate the warp. On countless other worlds, such mutations were met with fear, persecution, and often execution. Prospero instead recognized these individuals as humanity's future. The capital city of Tyrik-Kage stood as the physical embodiment of Prosperine philosophy. The City of Light, as it became known, rose from the desert plains in a configuration that seemed to defy conventional architecture. Pyramids of white stone dominated the skyline, their surfaces carved with geometric patterns and psychic sigils that served both decorative and functional purposes. These structures were not merely buildings, but psychic amplifiers, designed to channel and focus the warp energies that flowed through the city. Between the pyramids stood towers of various heights, their walls inlaid with precious metals and crystals that caught the sunlight and scattered it in complex patterns. The streets themselves were laid out according to mathematical principles that the Prosperine scholars believed harmonized with fundamental universal constants. The construction of Tyrik-Kage incorporated both conventional engineering and psychic manipulation. Stone blocks were quarried from Prospero's mountains and transported to the city through a combination of conventional vehicles and telekinetic levitation. Craftsmen worked alongside psychers, the former shaping stone with tools, while the latter used their abilities to position massive blocks with precision that would have been impossible through purely mechanical means. The result was architecture that seemed to flow organically despite being constructed from rigid materials. Arches curved in ways that suggested they should collapse under their own weight, yet psychic reinforcement kept them stable. Windows were positioned to capture specific angles of sunlight at particular times of day, creating patterns of light and shadow that the Prosperine scholars believed aided meditation and study. The great libraries of Tyrik-Kage represented the accumulated knowledge of Prospero's civilization. These repositories contained physical texts inscribed on everything from treated animal hide to synthetic materials developed by Prosperine technologists. The oldest volumes dated back to the founding of the colony during the Dark Age of technology, when Prospero had been settled by humans fleeing persecution on other worlds. These ancient texts describe technologies and sciences that had been lost during the Age of Strife, preserved by the Prosperine scholars even when they no longer fully understood their contents. Other sections contained works produced during Prospero's isolation, treatises on psychic phenomena, philosophical texts exploring the nature of consciousness and reality, and practical manuals detailing techniques for safely channeling warp energy. The libraries were not merely storage facilities, but active centers of learning. Scholars spent their entire lives within these halls, studying texts, conducting experiments, and adding their own observations to the collective knowledge. Reading rooms were designed with acoustic properties that minimized sound transmission, allowing multiple researchers to work in close proximity without disturbing one another. Some chambers were specially shielded to prevent psychic interference, allowing sensitive experiments to proceed without contamination from the ambient psychic energy that permeated Tyrik-Kage. Other rooms were deliberately constructed to amplify psychic resonance, facilitating group meditations and collaborative psychic workings. Before Magnus's arrival, Prosperine society had organized itself into various scholar cults, each focusing on different aspects of psychic study. These organizations functioned as combination schools, research institutes, and social groups. Membership was determined primarily by aptitude and interest, rather than birth or social status. A child who displayed talent for pyrokinesis would be directed toward the appropriate cult, while one who showed precognitive abilities would be guided elsewhere. This system had served Prospero well, allowing the planet to develop sophisticated understanding of psychic phenomena despite its isolation from the broader human civilization. Magnus's transformation of Prosperine society began subtly. He did not arrive as a conqueror demanding immediate changes, but as a student seeking to understand what the Prosperine scholars had already achieved. His intellectual humility, despite his obvious superiority in raw psychic power, earned him respect among the scholar cults. As he learned from them, he began to offer his own insights, observations drawn from his unique perspective and abilities. The scholar cults recognized that Magnus perceived aspects of the warp that remained invisible to them, and they eagerly incorporated his teachings into their practices. The establishment of the 5 primary fellowships represented Magnus's systematization of Prosperine psychic study. Where the scholar cults had been numerous and sometimes overlapping in their areas of focus, Magnus identified 5 fundamental disciplines that encompassed the full spectrum of psychic ability. The Corvidi Fellowship specialized in divination and precognition. These psychers trained themselves to perceive the branching paths of probability, reading the currents of fate to predict future events. Their techniques involved deep meditation and the interpretation of psychic visions, skills that required years of practice to master. The Corvidi understood that the future was not fixed but fluid, shaped by countless decisions and random events. Their predictions therefore dealt in probabilities rather than certainties, offering guidance rather than absolute knowledge. The Piri Fellowship focused on the manipulation of thermal energy through psychic means. These warriors and scholars learned to ignite fires with thought alone, to channel heat into devastating beams of energy, or to drain warmth from their surroundings to create zones of extreme cold. The Piri's abilities were among the most visibly destructive of the fellowships, and their training emphasized control and precision. An untrained Pyrokine could easily lose control of their abilities, immolating themselves and everyone around them. The Piri therefore developed extensive meditation techniques and mental exercises designed to maintain absolute discipline even in the chaos of combat. The Pavoni Fellowship studied biomancy, the psychic manipulation of living tissue. These specialists could accelerate healing, enhance physical capabilities, or even reshape flesh according to their will. The Pavoni's knowledge encompassed both the biological sciences and psychic technique. They understood anatomy, physiology, and genetics at a level that rivaled the most advanced Medicae facilities elsewhere in the galaxy. This scientific foundation allowed them to use their psychic abilities with precision, targeting specific cellular processes or organ systems. The Pavoni could cure diseases, repair traumatic injuries, and extend lifespans through careful application of their powers. The Raptora Fellowship specialized in telekinesis and the manipulation of physical forces. These psychers learned to move objects with their minds, to generate protective barriers of solidified psychic energy, and to manipulate gravity and momentum. The Raptora's training emphasized mathematical precision. They studied physics and engineering, understanding that effective telekinesis required knowledge of leverage, stress points, and material properties. A Raptora adept could disassemble a complex mechanism by selectively applying force to specific components, or could reinforce a structure by creating psychic supports at critical junctions. The Athenian Fellowship focused on telepathy and mental communication. These psychers developed the ability to read thoughts, project their consciousness into other minds, and communicate across vast distances without technological aid. The Athenians understood the ethical complexities of their abilities. The power to read thoughts carried with it the temptation to invade privacy and manipulate others. Magnus therefore insisted that the Athenian training include extensive philosophical study, exploring questions of consent, mental autonomy, and the proper use of telepathic abilities. The Athenians became not just powerful psychers but thoughtful individuals who understood the responsibility their abilities entailed. Each fellowship developed its own traditions, training methods, and internal hierarchy. They maintained separate facilities within Tizka, though members of different fellowships frequently collaborated on projects that required multiple disciplines. Magnus himself moved freely among all 5 fellowships, teaching and learning from each. He demonstrated abilities that spanned all 5 disciplines, showing that the divisions between them were somewhat artificial, useful for organizing training, but not representing fundamental limitations on what a sufficiently powerful psyker could achieve. The philosophical foundations of Magnus's approach to the warp distinguished Prospero from other psychic traditions that existed in the galaxy. Magnus viewed the immaterium not as a realm of chaos and madness to be feared, but as a natural phenomenon to be studied and understood. He compared psychic ability to any other human talent, arguing that just as some individuals possessed aptitude for mathematics or music, others were gifted with the ability to perceive and manipulate warp energy. The key to safe psychic practice, in Magnus's view, was knowledge. An educated psyker who understood the nature of the warp, who had studied its currents and inhabitants, could navigate its dangers successfully. This perspective led Magnus to encourage extensive exploration of the immaterium. He organized expeditions where groups of powerful psychers would project their consciousness into the warp, observing its structure and cataloging the entities they encountered. These explorations were conducted with careful preparation and multiple safeguards. The psychers involved underwent extensive training in mental discipline and psychic defense. They worked in groups, supporting one another and providing assistance if any individual encountered difficulty. Magnus himself often led these expeditions, his immense power serving as both shield and weapon against any hostile entities the group might encounter. The information gathered from these explorations filled entire sections of the Tizca libraries. Prosperine scholars compiled detailed taxonomies of warp entities, categorizing them by apparent intelligence, power level, and behavior patterns. They mapped the currents and eddies of the immaterium, identifying stable pathways and dangerous vortices. They developed theories about the fundamental nature of the warp, proposing that it represented a dimension where thought and emotion took physical form, where the collective unconscious of sentient beings manifested as a tangible reality. Magnus taught that sorcery, the deliberate manipulation of warp energy to achieve specific effects, was simply applied science. Just as a technologist might harness electrical energy by understanding the principles of physics and engineering, a sorcerer could channel warp energy by understanding the principles that govern the immaterium. This perspective stripped away much of the mysticism and superstition that surrounded psychic phenomena on other worlds. On Prospero, psychic ability was studied with the same rigor and methodology that scientists elsewhere applied to chemistry or biology. The isolation that Prospero experienced during the Age of Strife proved paradoxically beneficial to its development of psychic techniques. While the galaxy burned and human civilization collapsed into barbarism, Prospero remained relatively untouched. The planet's location in the Segmentum Pacificus placed it far from the major warp storms and Xenos invasions that devastated more centrally located worlds. The Prosperine scholars used this time to refine their understanding of psychic phenomena, conducting experiments and developing techniques that would have been impossible in less stable circumstances. They had centuries to perfect their methods, to learn from mistakes, and to build a comprehensive body of knowledge about the warp and humanity's relationship to it. The Emperor's Great Crusade swept across the galaxy like a tide of unity and conquest. From Terra, the master of mankind launched his fleets to reclaim the scattered worlds of humanity, bringing them into compliance through diplomacy or force. The Space Marine legions served as the primary instruments of this reconquest, each led by the Emperor himself, until such time as their genetic fathers could be found. The 15th Legion, created from Magnus's gene seed, had been prosecuting the Great Crusade for decades before their Primarch's discovery, but they fought under a shadow that threatened their very existence. The flesh change had manifested within the 15th Legion almost from its inception. This affliction struck without warning or apparent pattern, transforming legionaries into writhing masses of mutated tissue. A warrior might be standing in formation one moment, then suddenly his flesh would begin to ripple and change. Limbs would elongate or multiply, skin would split to reveal eyes or mouths in impossible locations, bones would soften and reform into grotesque new configurations. The transformation was agonizing and irreversible. Those afflicted lost all semblance of their former humanity, becoming mindless creatures of warped flesh that had to be destroyed by their battle brothers. The 15th Legion's command structure struggled to maintain operational effectiveness as the flesh change claimed more victims. Entire companies were reduced to half strength or less. The Legion's apothecaries worked desperately to identify the cause, examining gene seed samples, studying the afflicted warriors before they were destroyed, and comparing their findings with data from other legions. They found nothing conclusive. The flesh change appeared to be tied to the 15th Legion's gene seed specifically, some flaw in Magnus's genetic template that had been replicated in his sons. Other legions experienced their own complications, mutations that marked them as distinct from baseline humanity, but nothing approached the catastrophic instability that plagued the 15th. The Emperor's discovery of Magnus occurred during the Crusades' expansion into the Segmentum Pacificus. The master of mankind's psychic senses had been searching for his lost sons since the moment they were scattered, and Magnus's immense psychic presence blazed like a beacon once the Crusade fleets drew near enough to Prospero. The Emperor recognized his son immediately, perceiving not just Magnus's physical location, but the distinctive psychic signature that marked him as the 15th Primarch. The reunion that followed transcended normal communication. When the Emperor's flagship entered orbit around Prospero, father and son connected across the void through psychic rapport that required no words or technology. Their minds touched, and in that instant, Magnus perceived the Emperor's true nature in ways that none of his brothers ever would. He saw the vast intelligence that guided humanity's master, the accumulated knowledge of millennia, and the intricate plans that the Emperor had laid for humanity's future. The Emperor, in turn, perceived what Magnus had become during his years on Prospero. He saw the depth of knowledge his son had accumulated, the sophistication of the psychic techniques Magnus had developed, and the philosophical framework that guided the Crimson King's understanding of the warp. This initial contact established a connection between father and son that seemed deeper and more profound than the Emperor's relationships with his other Primarchs. Magnus descended from Prospero to meet his father in person, accompanied by the most senior members of the Prosperine scholar cults. The physical meeting confirmed what their psychic rapport had already established. Magnus knelt before the Emperor, acknowledging him as father and creator, while the Emperor raised his son and spoke of the great work they would accomplish together. The Emperor explained the Great Crusade, the vision of a unified human empire spanning the galaxy, and the role that Magnus and his legion would play in achieving that vision. He also revealed the existence of Magnus's gene sons, the warriors of the 15th Legion who carried his genetic legacy and awaited their Primarch's leadership. The Emperor's description of the flesh change afflicting the 15th Legion struck Magnus with the force of personal responsibility. These warriors suffered because of flaws in his own genetic template, imperfections that had been replicated in every legionary created from his gene seed. Magnus immediately requested permission to meet his legion and assess the situation personally. The Emperor agreed, and arrangements were made for the 15th Legion to travel to Prospero, where Magnus would assume command and, hopefully, find a solution to the curse that threatened to destroy his sons. The 15th Legion's arrival at Prospero was marked by a mixture of hope and desperation. The legionaries had heard of their Primarch's discovery, and many dared to believe that Magnus might possess knowledge or abilities that could halt the flesh change. They assembled in formation on the landing fields outside Tizca, thousands of warriors in Mark II power armor bearing the colors and insignia of the 15th. Magnus walked among them, and for the first time, the legionaries saw the being from whose genetic template they had been created. His crimson skin and towering stature marked him as unmistakably superhuman, while his psychic presence radiated power that even non-psychers could sense as a pressure against their minds. Magnus examined his sons with both physical sight and psychic perception. He studied their gene seed, analyzed the patterns of mutation, and traced the psychic emanations that surrounded each warrior. What he discovered horrified him. The flesh change was not simply a genetic flaw, but a curse woven into the very essence of his gene seed. The mutations were triggered by exposure to warp energy, and since every space marine possessed some degree of psychic potential, every member of the 15th Legion was vulnerable. The more psychically active a warrior, the greater his risk of succumbing to the flesh change. This cruel irony meant that the Legion's most gifted psychers, those who should have been its greatest assets, were also the most likely to transform into mindless abominations. The Primarch threw himself into research with desperate intensity. He He consulted the libraries of Tizca, searching ancient texts for any reference to similar afflictions. He conducted experiments on samples of his own tissue and gene seed, trying to identify the specific mechanisms that triggered the mutations. He led psychic expeditions deep into the warp, seeking knowledge from entities that dwelled in that realm. The Proserpine scholars assisted him, contributing their own expertise and conducting parallel research. Weeks became months as Magnus pursued every possible avenue of investigation. The breakthrough came not from scientific research, but from a contact made during one of Magnus's psychic expeditions into the warp. He encountered an entity of immense power, a being that claimed to be able to halt the flesh change afflicting his legion. This entity did not identify itself fully, presenting itself as simply a concerned party interested in preserving knowledge and learning. It spoke to Magnus of the flesh change as a curse that could be lifted, but only through a bargain. The entity demanded a price for its intervention, one of Magnus's eyes, freely given as a symbol of sacrifice and commitment. Magnus understood that he was dealing with something dangerous. His explorations of the warp had taught him that entities dwelling in the immaterium rarely acted from pure altruism. Yet he also recognized that his legion faced extinction if the flesh change could not be stopped. Every day brought new cases, more warriors lost to mutation. The 15th Legion was bleeding itself to death, and Magnus saw no other solution within his grasp. He made the calculation that many leaders before him had made when faced with impossible choices. He accepted the bargain, trading his eye for the survival of his sons. The ritual that followed was conducted in absolute secrecy. Magnus did not inform the Emperor or his brothers of what he intended. He gathered only the most trusted Proserpine scholars and explained what must be done. The actual removal of his eye was accomplished through psychic means rather than physical surgery. Magnus used his own abilities to sever the connections between his eye and his brain, to cauterize the psychic and physical wounds, and to reshape the socket into the single great eye that would become his most distinctive feature. The pain was immense, but Magnus endured it without complaint, knowing that his suffering purchased his legion's survival. The flesh change did not disappear immediately. The entity Magnus had bargained with had promised cessation of the mutations, not their instant reversal. Over the following weeks, however, the rate of new cases began to decline. Warriors who had been showing early symptoms found their conditions stabilizing. The random transformations that had plagued the Legion since its founding became less frequent, then rare, then finally stopped altogether. The 15th Legion had been saved, though Magnus now bore a permanent reminder of the price he had paid. Yet Magnus understood that the bargain alone would not be sufficient to protect his legion indefinitely. The flesh change had been halted, but the underlying vulnerability remained. His warriors still carried gene seed that was susceptible to warp-induced mutation. If they were to survive as a fighting force, they needed more than just the temporary reprieve that the bargain had purchased. They needed discipline, training, and techniques that would allow them to safely channel their psychic abilities without triggering the mutations that lurked in their genetic code. Magnus introduced the enumerations to his legion as the solution to this problem. These mental exercises and meditative techniques had been developed on Prospero over centuries of psychic study. The enumerations taught practitioners to compartmentalize their minds, to create mental structures that could contain and direct psychic energy safely. A warrior trained in the enumerations could access his psychic abilities without losing control, could channel warp energy through carefully constructed mental pathways that prevented the kind of uncontrolled exposure that triggered the flesh change. The training was rigorous and demanding. Every legionary of the 15th underwent instruction in the enumerations, regardless of their psychic potential. Even those with minimal psychic ability learned the basic techniques, understanding that any exposure to the warp carried risk. The Legion's librarians, its most powerful psychers, received the most intensive training. They learned not just the basic enumerations, but advanced techniques that Magnus had developed specifically for warriors who would be channeling significant psychic power in combat situations. The integration of Proserpine recruits into the Legion's ranks accelerated this transformation. Magnus opened recruitment on Prospero, drawing on the planet's population of trained psychers to replenish his legion's depleted companies. These prospering recruits brought with them knowledge of the fellowships and familiarity with psychic discipline that made them ideal candidates for transformation into space marines. The gene seed implantation process was modified to incorporate psychic monitoring, with Magnus personally overseeing each batch of recruits to ensure that the flesh change did not resurface during their transformation. The 15th Legion's identity began to shift as Magnus reshaped it according to his vision. The Emperor formally renamed them the Thousand Sons, a title that honored both their prospering heritage and their rebirth under Magnus's leadership. The Legion adopted new heraldry incorporating Egyptian-inspired imagery from prospering culture. Their armor was repainted in shades of red and gold, with individual companies adopting variations that reflected their specializations. The Legion's organization was restructured to incorporate the fellowship system, with warriors being assigned to different fellowships based on their psychic aptitudes and combat roles. The Thousand Sons combat doctrine evolved to emphasize psychic warfare as a primary tactical element rather than a supplementary capability. Magnus trained his warriors to use their abilities aggressively, to view psychic power as just another weapon in their arsenal alongside bolters and blades. The Corvidi provided battlefield divination, predicting enemy movements and identifying optimal tactical approaches. The Piri served as heavy assault specialists, unleashing devastating psychic fire against enemy positions. The Pavoni acted as combat medics and enhancement specialists, healing wounded warriors and augmenting their battle brothers' physical capabilities. The Raptora created defensive barriers and manipulated battlefield terrain through telekinesis. The Athenians coordinated communications and disrupted enemy command structures through telepathic interference. This emphasis on psychic warfare was balanced by a sophisticated understanding of conventional military tactics. Magnus had studied the campaigns of his brother Primarchs and learned from the Emperor's own strategic teachings. The Thousand Sons developed a preference for ranged engagement, using their psychic abilities to support devastating volleys of bolter fire and heavy weapons. They excelled at siege warfare, where their ability to predict enemy actions and manipulate physical forces gave them significant advantages. Their approach to combat emphasized precision and efficiency over brute force, seeking to achieve objectives with minimal casualties through superior planning and execution. The Legion's fleet was expanded and modified to support their unique requirements. Ships were equipped with specialized meditation chambers, where psychers could safely practice their abilities during transit through the warp. Librarium facilities were installed on every vessel, providing access to copies of the most important texts from the Tizca libraries. The Thousand Sons maintained a higher ratio of support staff to combat personnel than most legions, recognizing that their sophisticated approach to warfare required extensive logistical and technical support. The Thousand Sons returned to the Great Crusade under Magnus's leadership, demonstrated capabilities that impressed some Primarchs while deeply unsettling others. Their first major campaign after reunification with their Primarch involved the compliance of a cluster of worlds in the Segmentum Obscurus that had fallen under the influence of a Xenos psychic collective. The Thousand Sons deployed their full spectrum of psychic abilities, with Corvidi seers predicting enemy movements hours before they occurred, Piri adepts incinerating Xenos positions from distances that conventional weapons could not reach, and Athenian telepaths disrupting the psychic coordination that gave the Xenos their tactical advantage. The campaign concluded in weeks rather than the months that Imperial strategic planners had estimated, with minimal Thousand Sons casualties and the complete eradication of the Xenos threat. Reports of this campaign reached the other legions and their Primarchs, generating responses that ranged from admiration to profound concern. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars expressed appreciation for the Thousand Sons' efficiency and their willingness to adapt tactics to exploit enemy weaknesses. Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children praised the precision and artistry of their psychic techniques. Lorgar of the Word Bearers sought audiences with Magnus to discuss the philosophical implications of psychic power and its relationship to human transcendence. However, these positive reactions were counterbalanced by growing unease among other Primarchs, who viewed the Thousand Sons methods as dangerous and potentially heretical. Mortarion of the Death Guard emerged as one of the most vocal critics of the Thousand Sons and their psychic practices. The Primarch of the 14th Legion had been raised on the toxic death world of Barbarous, where he had witnessed the devastation wrought by warp-touched overlords who ruled through sorcerous power. Mortarion's entire worldview had been shaped by his struggle against these tyrants, and he associated all psychic phenomena with corruption and oppression. He viewed Magnus's teachings about controlled psychic development as naive at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. In Mortarion's assessment, there was no safe way to channel the powers of the warp. Any psyker, regardless of training or discipline, represented a potential gateway through which malevolent entities could enter real space. The philosophical differences between Mortarion and Magnus extended beyond simple disagreement about psychic safety protocols. Mortarion believed that humanity's strength lay in its physical resilience and determination, in the ability to endure and overcome through sheer force of will rather than supernatural shortcuts. He had conquered Barbarous through conventional warfare, leading armies of baseline humans against enemies who wielded sorcerous powers. His success had validated his belief that normal humans, properly organized and equipped, could defeat any foe without resorting to warp-derived abilities. The Thousand Sons' reliance on psychic power represented everything Mortarion despised: dependence on forces beyond human control, arrogance about abilities that could not be fully understood, and a willingness to traffic with the same energies that had enslaved humanity during Old Night. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves presented a more complex case. The 6th Legion employed rune priests who channeled what they claimed were the natural spiritual energies of their homeworld Fenris, rather than drawing power from the warp. This distinction was largely semantic, as both rune priests and Thousand Sons librarians manipulated psychic energy through their connection to the immaterium, but the cultural framing differed significantly. Fenrisian tradition held that rune priests served as intermediaries between the physical world and the spirit realm, channeling forces that were part of Fenris's natural order. The Thousand Sons' approach, by contrast, explicitly acknowledged the warp as the source of their power and sought to understand it through systematic study rather than ritualized tradition. Russ's objections to the Thousand Sons stemmed partly from cultural incompatibility and partly from genuine concern about their methods. The Wolf King valued instinct and tradition over intellectual analysis. His rune priests learned their craft through apprenticeship and spiritual initiation rather than academic study. They worked within frameworks established over generations, following practices that had proven safe through long experience. The Thousand Sons' experimental approach, their willingness to push boundaries and explore unknown aspects of psychic phenomena, struck Russ as reckless. He particularly objected to Magnus's expeditions into the deeper regions of the warp, ventures that the Crimson King justified as necessary for advancing human understanding, but which Russ viewed as unnecessary provocations of forces best left undisturbed. The tension between the Space Wolves and Thousand Sons manifested during several joint operations, where both legions were deployed to the same war zones. The two forces maintained professional cooperation at the tactical level, but their Primarchs clashed repeatedly over strategic decisions and operational methods. During the compliance of a fortress world whose defenders employed psychic defenses, Magnus proposed using Thousand Sons, seers, to identify weaknesses in the enemy's mental shields, then exploiting those vulnerabilities through coordinated psychic assault. Russ rejected this approach, insisting on a conventional siege that would avoid exposing Imperial forces to potential psychic contamination. The resulting disagreement delayed the campaign and led to higher casualties than Magnus believed necessary. Specific incidents during the Great Crusade provided ammunition for those who argued that the Thousand Sons' psychic practices posed unacceptable risks. On the world of Shrike, a Thousand Sons librarian named Haystar attempted to use precognitive abilities to predict the location of enemy reinforcements during a planetary compliance action. His divination extended too far into potential futures, and his consciousness became lost in the branching possibilities. Before his battle brothers could assist him, Haystar's physical body began manifesting mutations similar to those of the flesh change that had plagued the Legion before Magnus's intervention. The Thousand Sons managed to stabilize Haystar and reverse the mutations through immediate application of the enumerations, but observers from other legions who witnessed the incident reported it as evidence that the Thousand Sons remained vulnerable to warp-induced corruption. Another incident occurred during the pacification of a rebellious hive world, where the Thousand Sons deployed alongside elements of the Iron Hands. A Pavoni biomancer named Phosis, Tyrik-Kage, used his abilities to heal wounded civilians caught in the crossfire of the urban combat. His intentions were humanitarian, seeking to minimize collateral damage and demonstrate the Imperium's benevolence to the conquered population. However, some of the civilians he treated developed unexpected complications in the days following their healing. Tissue that Tyrik-Kage had regenerated began growing uncontrollably, forming tumorous masses that caused agonizing deaths. Investigation revealed that Tyrik-Kage had inadvertently introduced warp-tainted cellular structures during his healing process, mutations so subtle that even his sophisticated understanding of biomancy had failed to detect them. The Iron Hands Primarch Ferrus Manus cited this incident as proof that psychic manipulation of biological processes was inherently unreliable and dangerous. The most damaging incident involved the world of Archreach Secundus, where the Thousand Sons were tasked with suppressing a rebellion led by a cabal of rogue psychers. Magnus deployed a strike force led by Ahriman, his chief librarian and most trusted student. The Thousand Sons engaged the rebel psychers in direct psychic combat, a confrontation that took place simultaneously on the physical battlefield and in the Immaterium. The psychic energies unleashed during this battle created a temporary rift between real space and the warp, a phenomenon that persisted for several hours after the fighting concluded. During this period, citizens of Archreach Secundus reported visions and hallucinations, while some individuals with latent psychic abilities underwent spontaneous and uncontrolled manifestations of their powers. The Thousand Sons managed to seal the rift and restore stability, but not before thousands of civilians had been affected. Other Imperial forces present during the campaign, including contingents from the Ultramarines and Imperial Army units, filed reports describing the incident as evidence that Thousand Sons operations created unacceptable risks to nearby populations. These incidents, along with numerous smaller complaints and concerns, accumulated over the decades of the Great Crusade. The iterators and remembrancers who accompanied the Crusade fleets documented the Thousand Sons' methods and transmitted their observations back to Terra. Imperial commanders who had worked alongside the 15th Legion submitted after-action reports that praised their effectiveness while noting concerns about their reliance on psychic powers. The Administratum compiled this information, creating a growing file of documentation that suggested the Thousand Sons represented a potential liability despite their tactical successes. The broader issue extended beyond the Thousand Sons to encompass all Librarius programs across the Space Marine legions. Following the rediscovery of the Primarchs and the expansion of the Great Crusade, several legions had established formal Librarius departments to train and organize their psychers. The White Scars, Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and several other legions maintained librarians who served as specialized support units within their forces. These programs varied in their approaches and philosophies, but all shared the common goal of harnessing psychic abilities for military purposes. The success of these programs, particularly the sophisticated methods employed by the Thousand Sons, had encouraged their expansion and formalization. However, the growing prominence of librarians in psychic warfare raised fundamental questions about the Imperium's relationship with the warp. The Emperor had always maintained strict control over humanity's psychers, establishing institutions like the Scholastica Psychana to identify, train, and monitor individuals with psychic abilities. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica managed the black ships that collected psychers from across the Imperium, determining which individuals could be safely trained and which posed too great a risk. This system reflected the Emperor's understanding that psychers were both essential to the Imperium's function and potentially catastrophically dangerous if left uncontrolled. The Space Marine Librarius programs operated somewhat outside this established framework. While Legion librarians underwent training and maintained discipline, they were not subject to the same level of oversight as civilian psychers. The Primarchs who led these legions exercised considerable autonomy in determining how their librarians were trained and deployed. This decentralization worried some Imperial officials who believed that psychic abilities required centralized control and standardized safety protocols. The Thousand Sons, with their aggressive exploration of psychic phenomena and their willingness to push beyond established boundaries, exemplified these concerns. The Council of Nicaea did not emerge spontaneously, but rather resulted from years of accumulating pressure and debate. Mortarion had been advocating for restrictions on psychic practices since shortly after his reunification with the Emperor. He raised the issue repeatedly in councils of war and strategic planning sessions, arguing that the Legion's increasing reliance on psychers created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Russ added his voice to these concerns, though his objections focused more on the Thousand Sons specifically rather than all Librarius programs. Other Primarchs contributed their own perspectives, with some supporting continued use of psychic abilities under proper supervision, while others called for complete prohibition. The Emperor's decision to convene a formal council to address these issues represented an acknowledgement that the matter required definitive resolution. The Master of Mankind had remained largely silent during the earlier debates, allowing his sons to argue their positions while he observed and considered. His announcement that a great convocation would be held on the world of Nicaea, where representatives from all legions would present evidence and arguments regarding the use of psychic powers, signaled that he had decided the time had come for judgment. The location was chosen for its symbolic neutrality, a world recently brought into compliance that had no prior connection to any legion or Primarch. The preparations for the council involved extensive logistical coordination. Representatives from every Space Marine Legion were summoned to attend, along with senior members of the Imperial Administration, the Mechanicum, and other key Imperial institutions. The Emperor himself would preside over the proceedings, with several Primarchs present to offer testimony and arguments. The agenda was structured to allow comprehensive examination of the issues, with time allocated for presentation of evidence, cross-examination of witnesses, and deliberation on the proper course of action. Magnus received the summons to Nicaea with a mixture of anticipation and concern. He recognized that the council represented an opportunity to defend the Librarius programs and to educate his brothers about the true nature of psychic power. At the same time, he understood that powerful voices would be raised against him, and that the outcome was far from certain. The Crimson King began preparing his arguments, marshaling evidence of the Thousand Sons' successes, and developing explanations for the incidents that critics had cited as evidence of danger. He consulted with his chief librarian Ahriman and other senior members of his legion, refining his positions and anticipating the objections that would be raised. The Council of Nicaea convened in the amphitheater that had been constructed specifically for this purpose, a vast circular structure that could accommodate thousands of attendees while maintaining acoustics that allowed every voice to be heard clearly. The Emperor sat upon a raised dais at the center, his presence dominating the space even when he remained silent. Around him gathered his sons, those Primarchs who had chosen to attend in person rather than sending representatives. Magnus stood among them, his single eye surveying the assembled crowd with a mixture of confidence and underlying tension. He had prepared extensively for this moment, believing that reason and evidence would prevail over superstition and fear. The proceedings began with testimony from those who opposed the use of psychic powers within the legions. Mortarion spoke at length about his experiences on Barbaros, describing in visceral detail the horrors inflicted by the warp-touched overlords who had ruled that world. He presented the case that any use of psychic power, regardless of the safeguards employed, represented an unacceptable risk to the Imperium. His words carried weight not just because of his position, but because of the evident sincerity of his convictions. Mortarion genuinely believed that he was protecting humanity from a threat that others failed to recognize or chose to ignore. Russ followed with his own testimony, though his position was more nuanced than outright prohibition. The Wolf King acknowledged that his own legion employed rune priests, but he drew distinctions between what he characterized as the natural spiritual practices of Fenris and the deliberate manipulation of warp energies that the Thousand Sons practiced. He cited specific incidents where Thousand Sons operations had resulted in unintended consequences, using these examples to argue that Magnus's approach to psychic development encouraged recklessness and insufficient respect for the dangers involved. Russ's testimony was particularly damaging because it came from a Primarch whose own legion utilized psychic abilities, lending credibility to his criticisms of the Thousand Sons' methods. Magnus mounted his defense with the full force of his intellect and rhetorical skill. He explained the theoretical foundations of psychic phenomena, describing the warp as a natural aspect of reality rather than some external corruption. He detailed the training regimens that the Thousand Sons employed, emphasizing the rigorous discipline and extensive safeguards that prevented the kind of uncontrolled manifestations that his critics feared. He presented evidence of the Thousand Sons' military successes, campaigns where psychic abilities had saved lives and achieved objectives that would have been impossible through conventional means alone. His arguments were logical, well-structured, and supported by extensive documentation. Yet Magnus made critical errors in his presentation that undermined his position. His confidence in his own understanding led him to dismiss legitimate concerns as ignorance or superstition. When questioned about specific incidents where Thousand Sons operations had resulted in negative consequences, Magnus tended to explain these as aberrations or the results of insufficient training, rather than acknowledging any fundamental risks inherent to psychic practice. He spoke of the warp with a familiarity that disturbed many listeners, describing entities and phenomena that he had encountered during his psychic expeditions, as though they were mere subjects of academic study rather than potential threats. His certainty that psychic power could be fully understood and controlled through knowledge and discipline struck some observers as exactly the kind of hubris that preceded catastrophic failure. The Emperor's judgment, when it came, represented a compromise that satisfied no one completely while addressing the core concerns that had prompted the Council. He decreed that the Librarius programs would be disbanded across all Space Marine legions. Psychers would still be recruited and their abilities utilized, but the formal study and aggressive development of psychic techniques would cease. The Emperor's reasoning, as he explained it, centered on the need for caution given humanity's incomplete understanding of the warp and the documented risks associated with psychic practice. He acknowledged the military value of psychic abilities, but determined that the potential dangers outweighed the tactical advantages. This decision was formalized in what became known as the Edict of Nicaea, a binding decree that all legions were required to implement immediately. The edict did not prohibit psychers from serving in the legions entirely, but it severely restricted how their abilities could be employed and developed. The experimental approaches that Magnus had championed, the aggressive exploration of psychic phenomena, and the systematic expansion of psychic capabilities were explicitly forbidden. The Thousand Sons were hit particularly hard by this decree, as their entire combat doctrine and organizational structure had been built around the sophisticated use of psychic abilities. Magnus departed Nicaea in a state of frustrated disbelief. He had expected that reason and evidence would prevail, that his father would recognize the value of the knowledge that the Thousand Sons had accumulated and the sophistication of their methods. Instead, the Emperor had sided with those who counseled restriction and caution, choosing to limit humanity's development of psychic potential rather than embrace it fully. The Crimson King returned to Prospero, convinced that his father had made a grave error, one that would hamper humanity's ability to defend itself against threats that Magnus knew existed in the galaxy. The implementation of the edict created significant challenges for the Thousand Sons. Magnus ordered compliance with his father's decree, though he did so with obvious reluctance. The Legion's Librarius was formally disbanded, its members reassigned to conventional combat roles. The practice of the enumerations continued, as these mental disciplines were necessary to prevent the resurgence of the flesh change, but the advanced psychic techniques that had made the Thousand Sons so formidable were officially discontinued. Training programs were modified to emphasize conventional warfare, and the fellowship system was restructured to function without its psychic components. However, Magnus himself did not cease his own psychic explorations. He rationalized that the edict applied to the legions and their organized psychic programs, not to his personal studies as a Primarch. He continued to project his consciousness into the warp, to seek knowledge from the entities he encountered there, and to push the boundaries of his understanding. This decision to continue his research while requiring his legion to comply with the edict represented a compromise between his obligations to his father and his conviction that the pursuit of knowledge must continue. It was also a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. The years following Nicaea saw the Great Crusade continue its expansion across the galaxy. The Thousand Sons adapted to their new restrictions, proving that they remained an effective fighting force even with their psychic capabilities curtailed. Magnus maintained regular communication with several of his brother Primarchs, particularly those like Lorgar, who shared his interest in understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. He also continued his correspondence with the Emperor, though their relationship had been strained by the outcome of Nicaea. Magnus remained convinced that he could eventually persuade his father to reconsider the edict once he had accumulated sufficient evidence of the safety and value of properly conducted psychic research. It was during one of his deep explorations of the warp that Magnus discovered the terrible truth about Horus. The Crimson King had been conducting a particularly ambitious scrying, projecting his consciousness far from Prospero to observe the currents of the immaterium across vast distances. His attention was drawn to a disturbance in the warp, a concentration of malevolent energies that seemed to be centered on a specific location in real space. Magnus focused his perception on this anomaly, pushing through layers of psychic interference to identify its source. What he saw shook him to his core. Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's most trusted son, and the commander of the entire Great Crusade, had been corrupted by the ruinous powers of chaos. Magnus perceived the taint that had infected his brother's soul, saw the influence of the warp entities that were manipulating the War Master toward treachery. The vision was fragmentary and difficult to interpret fully, but its essential truth was undeniable. Horus was being turned against the Emperor, and through him, the forces of chaos intended to strike at humanity's heart. Magnus witnessed glimpses of the plans being laid, saw other Primarchs being approached and corrupted, and understood that a galaxy-spanning rebellion was being orchestrated. The magnitude of this discovery left Magnus reeling. Horus's betrayal would not be a simple military revolt, but an existential threat to everything the Emperor had built. The War Master commanded the loyalty of vast imperial forces, and his charisma and tactical genius made him perhaps the most dangerous possible traitor. If Horus turned against Terra, he would bring significant portions of the Imperium with him. The damage would be catastrophic, potentially destroying humanity's chance at galactic unity and leaving it vulnerable to the Xenos threats and warp entities that surrounded it on all sides. Magnus understood immediately that he needed to warn the Emperor. This information could not wait for normal communication channels or official reports. The conspiracy he had uncovered was already in motion, and any delay in alerting his father could allow it to progress beyond the point where it could be stopped. The Crimson King considered his options with desperate urgency. Standard astropathic communication was too slow and too unreliable for something this critical. The message might be intercepted or delayed, and even if it reached Terra, it would take time for the Emperor to receive it and verify its contents. Magnus needed to deliver his warning directly, immediately, in a way that would allow the Emperor to perceive the truth of what was happening with his own senses. The decision to use sorcery to send his warning came from this desperate calculation. Magnus knew that the Edict of Nicaea explicitly forbade the kind of massive psychic working he was contemplating. He understood that his father had commanded restraint in the use of psychic powers, that the Emperor had determined such practices were too dangerous to continue. Yet Magnus also believed that the circumstances justified breaking this command. The threat posed by Horus's corruption exceeded any risk associated with a single psychic transmission. If the Emperor could be warned in time, if the conspiracy could be exposed before it fully manifested, then the breaking of the edict would be forgiven as a necessary action taken in extremis. Magnus convinced himself that his father would understand. The Emperor of all beings would recognize that rigid adherence to rules in the face of an existential threat represented foolish inflexibility. The Crimson King believed that once his father perceived the danger through the psychic warning Magnus would send, he would acknowledge that Magnus had made the correct choice. The Edict of Nicaea would be revealed as an overcautious restriction that the Emperor himself would set aside when confronted with genuine necessity. This rationalization allowed Magnus to proceed with his plan, despite his awareness that he was directly violating his father's explicit command. The preparation for the psychic sending required gathering immense amounts of warp energy. Magnus could not accomplish this feat through his own power alone, even given his tremendous psychic strength. He would need to draw on external sources, to channel energies from the immaterium itself in quantities that would allow him to project his consciousness and message across the galaxy instantaneously. The Crimson King began the ritual in the depths of his sanctum on Prospero, surrounded by psychic amplification devices and protective wards that the Prosperine scholars had constructed over decades. He entered a meditative state, extending his consciousness into the warp and beginning to accumulate the power he would need. The psychic energies Magnus gathered created disturbances that were felt across Prospero. Psychers throughout Tizca experienced headaches and disorientation as the warp currents shifted in response to their Primarch's working. The sky above the capital darkened despite the sun's position, clouds forming in unnatural patterns that reflected the psychic turbulence. Magnus remained focused on his task, drawing more and more power into himself, shaping it into the form that would allow him to pierce the barriers between Prospero and Terra, to deliver his warning directly into the Emperor's mind. What Magnus did not fully understand was the nature of the defenses he was about to breach. The Emperor had been conducting a secret project beneath the Imperial Palace, one that represented perhaps his greatest work since the creation of the Primarchs themselves. The Webway project aimed to provide humanity with access to the ancient Eldari network of tunnels through the warp, allowing safe and reliable faster-than-light travel without the risks associated with conventional warp transit. The Emperor had been working on this project for decades, constructing a gateway beneath the palace and extending a human-built section of Webway that would eventually connect to the larger network. This work required maintaining incredibly sophisticated psychic barriers that kept the raw warp at bay while allowing controlled access to the Webway tunnels. Magnus released his psychic sending with all the force he had accumulated. His consciousness, wrapped in a shell of warp energy, shot across the galaxy like a spear of pure thought. It crossed the vast distance between Prospero and Terra in an instant, bypassing all conventional barriers and protections. Magnus's awareness touched the outer edges of Terra's psychic defenses, the wards and shields that the Emperor had placed around the throne world to protect it from warp-based attacks. The Crimson King's sending was too powerful to be stopped by these outer defenses. It punched through them, continuing inward toward the Imperial Palace itself. The catastrophe occurred when Magnus's psychic sending struck the barriers protecting the Webway project. These defenses were far more sophisticated and powerful than the outer wards, designed to contain the pressure of the raw warp itself. They had been calibrated with incredible precision, maintaining a delicate balance that allowed the Webway gate to function while preventing any breach. Magnus's uncontrolled psychic assault hit these barriers with the force of a psychic battering ram. The carefully maintained balance shattered instantly. The barriers that had been holding back the warp collapsed, and the immaterium came flooding through the breach that Magnus had created. The destruction was immediate and terrible. The human-built section of the Webway that the Emperor had spent decades constructing was torn apart as warp energies flooded through it. The controlled environment that had allowed safe passage became a nightmare realm where the laws of physics ceased to apply consistently. Demons poured through the breach, entities of the warp given form and purpose by the sudden opening. They fell upon the workers and guards who had been maintaining the Webway project, slaughtering thousands before any organized defense could be mounted. The psychic shockwave from the breach radiated outward through the imperial palace, killing or incapacitating psychers and causing structural damage to the ancient edifice. The Emperor had been working within the Webway project when Magnus's sending struck. He felt the barriers collapse and immediately understood what had happened. His most psychically gifted son had done the one thing that could destroy decades of work, had breached the defenses of the Webway project through sheer ignorant force. The Emperor's response was instantaneous. He abandoned his work and rushed to the breach, throwing his own immense psychic power into containing the flood of warp energy and preventing it from consuming more of the palace. The Master of Mankind understood immediately that this catastrophe would require his constant attention. The breach could not be sealed quickly or easily. It would demand his presence, his power dedicated to holding back the warp while a more permanent solution could be found. Magnus's consciousness, having delivered its warning, recoiled from what it had done. The Crimson King perceived the destruction he had caused, saw the Emperor's desperate struggle to contain the breach, and understood with horrifying clarity that he had made a terrible mistake. His warning about Horus's corruption had been delivered, but the cost was incalculable. The Webway project, humanity's hope for safe travel through the galaxy, lay in ruins. Thousands were dead. The Emperor was trapped, forced to maintain a psychic barrier that would consume his attention and prevent him from leading the Imperium directly. All of this destruction had come from Magnus's certainty that he knew best, that the urgency of his warning justified any action. The psychic backlash from the breach and the Emperor's wrath struck Magnus with devastating force. The Crimson King's consciousness was battered by energies that even his formidable defenses could not fully withstand. His psychic form began to fragment under the assault, pieces of his soul breaking away and scattering. This fragmentation was not merely metaphorical, but a literal shattering of Magnus's essential being. Parts of his consciousness and power separated from the whole, becoming independent shards that would later need to be recovered. The pain was beyond anything Magnus had experienced, a spiritual agony that transcended physical suffering. Magnus's physical body on Prospero collapsed as his consciousness fragmented. The 1,000 Suns who had been monitoring their Primarch rushed to his side, finding him unconscious and barely alive. His psychic presence, normally a beacon that blazed across the warp, had become fractured and diminished. The Legion's most skilled psychers worked desperately to stabilize their Primarch, using every technique they knew to prevent his complete dissolution. They succeeded in anchoring the core of Magnus's consciousness to his physical form, but they could not restore what had been lost. Pieces of the Crimson King's soul remained scattered, and his power, while still immense, was no longer whole. The immediate aftermath saw Magnus recovering slowly on Prospero, while the 1,000 Suns tried to understand what had happened. Their Primarch could not explain fully, his memories of the incident fragmented and confused. He knew that he had discovered something terrible about Horus, that he had tried to warn the Emperor, and that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The details remained unclear, obscured by the trauma of his soul's fragmentation and the psychic backlash he had endured. The 1,000 Suns knew only that their Primarch had been gravely injured, and that the injury was somehow connected to a psychic working of unprecedented scale. Word from Terra came not through normal channels, but through a fleet that translated into the Prospero system weeks after the catastrophe. The ships bore the gray and red heraldry of the Space Wolves, and their commander carried orders sealed with the Emperor's own mark. Magnus, still recovering from his injuries, received the communication with growing dread. The Emperor had passed judgment on what the Crimson King had done. The sentence was absolute and without appeal. The 1,000 Suns were declared traitors to the Imperium. Prospero was to be razed, its libraries burned, and its population scattered. Magnus himself was to be brought to Terra to face the Emperor's justice. The Space Wolves had been dispatched to carry out this sentence, and they were already preparing for planetary assault. The Space Wolves' fleet that emerged from the warp above Prospero represented one of the largest military forces ever assembled for a single compliance action. Hundreds of vessels filled the orbital space around the planet, their gray hulls bearing the wolf's head insignia of the 6th Legion. Battle barges and strike cruisers formed the core of the fleet, supported by numerous escort vessels and troop transports. The sheer scale of the force made the Emperor's intentions unmistakably clear. This was not a police action or a limited punitive expedition. The Space Wolves had come to destroy the Thousand Suns completely. Leman Russ commanded the fleet from his flagship, the Hrafikal. The Wolf King had received his orders directly from Terra, transmitted through channels that bypassed the normal Imperial command structure. The message had been explicit in its requirements. Magnus and the Thousand Suns were to be brought to account for their violations of the Edict of Nicaea and for the catastrophic damage they had inflicted upon the Emperor's works. Russ understood that his brother had committed some terrible transgression, though the exact nature of Magnus's crime remained unclear. The orders spoke of psychic assault, of barriers breached and sacred projects destroyed, but the details were vague. What Russ did not know was that his orders had been altered during transmission. Horus, already deep in his corruption and planning his rebellion against the Emperor, had intercepted the original message. The War Master's instructions from Terra had commanded Russ to apprehend Magnus and return him to face the Emperor's judgment. The Thousand Suns were to be censured, and their psychic practices permanently curtailed, but the Legion itself was to be preserved as a fighting force. These were the Emperor's actual commands, measured and proportionate to Magnus's transgression despite its severity. Horus modified these orders with calculated precision. The War Master understood Russ's temperament and his long-standing animosity toward Magnus and the Thousand Suns. He knew that the Wolf King needed only slight encouragement to interpret his mission in the harshest possible terms. The alterations Horus made were subtle, changing emphasis rather than inventing entirely new instructions. Where the Emperor had commanded apprehension, Horus's version spoke of sanction. Where the original orders mentioned censure, the modified text suggested extermination. The changes were crafted to appear as clarifications rather than contradictions, giving Russ the impression that the Emperor wanted the Thousand Suns destroyed rather than merely punished. The War Master's manipulation extended beyond simple text modification. Horus contacted Russ directly through astropathic communication, speaking as the Emperor's chosen commander and reinforcing the altered interpretation of the orders. He reminded Russ of every incident where the Thousand Suns' psychic practices had resulted in negative consequences, every argument Magnus had made at Nicaea that had demonstrated his arrogance and refusal to accept proper limitations. Horus painted Magnus's recent actions as the inevitable result of allowing the Crimson King's hubris to go unchecked, suggesting that only complete destruction of the Thousand Suns could prevent future catastrophes. The War Master's words found fertile ground in Russ's existing prejudices and concerns about sorcery. The Space Wolves were not alone in their mission. The fleet included significant contingents from two other Imperial organizations whose presence made the assault force even more formidable. The Sisters of Silence, the Emperor's witch hunters and psychic nulls, had deployed in unprecedented numbers. Thousands of these warriors accompanied the Space Wolves, their presence serving both practical and symbolic purposes. The Sisters' unique nature as psychic blanks made them devastating opponents for psychers. Their very presence disrupted psychic abilities, creating zones where warp-based powers simply failed to function. Against an enemy like the Thousand Suns, whose entire combat doctrine relied on psychic warfare, the Sisters of Silence represented a perfect counter. The Adeptus Custodes had also sent forces to join the assault. These golden-armored warriors served as the Emperor's personal guard, the most elite fighting force in the Imperium. Their presence indicated the gravity with which Terra viewed Magnus's transgression. Custodian Tribune Valdor led the Custodes contingent, bringing with him centuries of combat experience and authority that derived directly from the Emperor himself. Valdor's role was not merely military, but also political. He carried the Emperor's personal seal and had been granted authority to speak with the Emperor's voice in all matters relating to the Prospero operation. His presence served as confirmation that the orders Russ had received were genuine and carried the full weight of Imperial authority. The Imperial fleet elements that supported the operation included numerous army regiments and auxiliary forces. Troop transports carried tens of thousands of soldiers who would secure territory once the Space Marines had broken the initial resistance. Supply vessels contained the ammunition, fuel, and provisions necessary for an extended campaign. The logistical preparation reflected expectations of significant resistance, though the strategic planners had not anticipated that the Thousand Sons would mount an effective defense given their recent censure and the overwhelming force arrayed against them. On Prospero's surface, the Thousand Sons remained largely unaware of the approaching doom. Magnus had not shared the full details of what had transpired when he sent his warning to Terra. His legion knew only that their Primarch had been injured during a psychic working, and that he had been recovering in seclusion since the incident. The normal operations of the legion continued, with training exercises and administrative duties proceeding according to routine. Some of the more psychically sensitive members of the legion reported disturbing dreams and visions, but these were attributed to aftershocks from whatever working Magnus had attempted. The Thousand Sons' defensive posture was minimal. Prospero had never been a fortress world, and the Legion had not anticipated needing to defend their homeworld against Imperial forces. The planet's orbital defenses consisted of standard monitoring stations and a modest defensive fleet sufficient to deter pirates or minor Xenos incursions. These forces were completely inadequate against the armada that Russ had brought. The ground-based military installations were similarly unprepared, designed more for training and ceremonial purposes than actual warfare. The Great Pyramids and Towers of Tizca contained no significant fortifications, their architecture prioritizing aesthetic and psychic resonance over defensive capability. Magnus himself remained in his sanctum deep within the largest pyramid in Tizca. The Crimson King had not emerged since his catastrophic attempt to warn the Emperor, and his closest advisors had been unable to draw him out. Ahriman, the chief librarian, had tried repeatedly to speak with his Primarch, seeking guidance on how the Legion should respond to the increasingly disturbing psychic portents that suggested approaching danger. Magnus refused these audiences, sending word through intermediaries that he required solitude to complete his recovery. In truth, the Primarch was paralyzed by guilt and despair over what he had done. He understood that he had destroyed his father's greatest work and had proven his critics at Nicaea correct through his arrogant certainty that he knew better than the Emperor himself. The Space Wolves' assault began with orbital bombardment that targeted Prospero's defensive installations and communication facilities. Lance strikes from the fleet's capital ships vaporized the monitoring stations that might have provided early warning of the ground assault. Macro-cannon batteries reduced the defensive fleet to debris, destroying ships before they could raise shields or maneuver to defensive positions. The bombardment was precise and overwhelming, eliminating Prospero's ability to coordinate a planetary defense or call for reinforcement within minutes of its commencement. Drop pods began falling toward Tizca while the orbital bombardment continued. Thousands of Space Wolves descended in the armored capsules, their trajectories calculated to place them at key positions throughout the capital city. The drop pod assault was accompanied by Thunderhawk gunships and Storm Eagle transports carrying additional troops and heavy equipment. The Sisters of Silence deployed alongside the Space Wolves, their Null Maidens creating zones of psychic silence that disrupted the Thousand Sons' attempts to coordinate their response telepathically. The Adeptus Custodes descended in smaller numbers, but with devastating effect, their superior equipment and training making each custodian worth multiple Space Marines in combat effectiveness. The Thousand Sons' initial response was confused and disorganized. The Legion had not been at combat readiness when the attack began, with many warriors engaged in routine activities throughout Tizca. The sudden assault caught them dispersed and unprepared, unable to form coherent defensive formations before the Space Wolves were among them. Individual Thousand Sons fought back with desperate courage, but without coordination or leadership, they were cut down by enemies who had prepared specifically for this engagement. The Space Wolves showed no mercy, executing wounded Thousand Sons rather than taking prisoners and burning everything that might contain knowledge or records. Magnus remained in his sanctum as the battle raged through Tizca. The Primarch had foreseen this moment through his precognitive abilities, had known that punishment for his transgression would come. He had decided that he would not resist, that he would accept whatever judgment the Emperor imposed as penance for his catastrophic error. This decision extended to his legion. Magnus commanded through psychic projection that the Thousand Sons were not to mount an organized defense, that they were to accept their fate as he was accepting his. This order, transmitted directly into the minds of his sons, paralyzed the Legion's command structure. Senior officers who might have organized effective resistance found themselves unable to countermand their Primarch's explicit command, even as they watched their brothers being slaughtered. Ahriman refused to accept Magnus's command for passive acceptance of destruction. The chief librarian gathered those Thousand Sons he could reach, forming them into defensive positions and organizing counterattacks against the Space Wolves' advance. He violated his Primarch's orders openly, believing that Magnus's judgment had been compromised by guilt and despair. Other senior members of the Legion followed Ahriman's example, recognizing that without organized resistance, the Thousand Sons would be annihilated completely. These officers began rallying their warriors, establishing defensive perimeters around key locations in Tyrik-Kage, and attempting to coordinate a coherent response to the invasion. The fighting intensified as the Thousand Sons began to mount effective resistance. The Legion's warriors demonstrated their training and capabilities despite being caught unprepared, using their knowledge of Tyrik-Kage's layout to ambush Space Wolves units and establish killing zones. The Thousand Sons' psychic abilities, even curtailed by the presence of the Sisters of Silence, provided advantages in coordination and tactical awareness. Corvidi seers predicted Space Wolves' movements seconds before they occurred, allowing their brothers to position themselves optimally. Piri Adepts unleashed gouts of psychic flame that incinerated entire squads of attackers. The Raptora raised kinetic barriers that deflected bolter rounds and provided cover for Thousand Sons positions. The Space Wolves adapted their tactics to counter the Thousand Sons' psychic warfare. They concentrated their forces around Sisters of Silence units, using the blank's psychic nullification to create zones where the Thousand Sons could not employ their abilities effectively. The Wolf Guard, Russ's elite veterans, led assaults against positions held by Thousand Sons officers, targeting the Legion's command structure to further disrupt their coordination. Grey Hunters advanced methodically through Tyrik-Kage streets, clearing buildings and eliminating resistance with brutal efficiency. The Space Wolves' approach emphasized overwhelming force and rapid advance, giving the Thousand Sons no time to establish stable defensive lines. The great libraries of Tyrik-Kage became focal points of the battle. The Space Wolves had been ordered to destroy these repositories of knowledge, to burn the texts that contained the psychic lore and sorceress techniques that Magnus had accumulated. Thousand Sons forces concentrated around the libraries, recognizing that these buildings contained irreplaceable knowledge gathered over centuries. The fighting around these locations was particularly intense, with neither side willing to yield. Space Wolves breached the outer walls with melta charges and demolition teams, while Thousand Sons held the interior chambers with fanatical determination. The libraries burned despite these efforts, flames consuming texts that detailed discoveries and techniques that could never be recovered. Magnus finally emerged from his sanctum as the scale of the slaughter became undeniable. The Primarch had intended to accept punishment stoically, but watching his sons die while he remained passive proved unbearable. He rose from his meditation and projected his consciousness across Tyrik-Kage, perceiving the full extent of the battle. Thousands of his legion were already dead, cut down by Space Wolves who showed no interest in accepting surrender or taking prisoners. The city he had built was burning, its pyramids and towers reduced to rubble by orbital strikes and ground combat. The libraries that contained the accumulated knowledge of Prospero's civilization were being systematically destroyed, their contents lost forever. The Crimson King's rage ignited with a fury that shook Prospero's psychic landscape. Magnus's acceptance of punishment had been predicated on the assumption that the Emperor's justice would be measured and proportionate. This was not justice, but extermination, the complete destruction of everything Magnus had built and everyone he loved. His sons were being slaughtered not as punishment for specific crimes, but simply for existing. The knowledge that the Thousand Sons had gathered was being burned not because it was dangerous, but because it represented ideas that others feared to understand. Magnus's guilt transformed into anger, and that anger manifested as psychic power that dwarfed anything the Thousand Sons had displayed thus far. Magnus's physical form grew as he channeled immense amounts of warp energy into himself. The Primarch's body expanded to titanic proportions, his already considerable height increasing until he towered over the pyramids of Tizca. His single eye blazed with power that could be seen from orbit, a beacon of crimson light that marked his position unmistakably. The psychic pressure radiating from Magnus's transformed form was so intense that even non-psychers could feel it as physical force pressing against their bodies. Space wolves and Thousand Suns alike paused in their combat, all eyes turning toward the transformed Primarch who had finally entered the battle. Leman Russ recognized that the decisive moment had arrived. The Wolf King had been directing the assault from a command position, coordinating his forces, and ensuring that the attack proceeded according to plan. Magnus's emergence changed the tactical situation fundamentally. Russ understood that no amount of conventional force could overcome a Primarch operating at full power, particularly one as psychically potent as Magnus. The Wolf King would need to engage his brother directly, to match Primarch against Primarch in combat that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. The two Primarchs met in the ruins of Tizca's central plaza, the space between them cleared by their mere presence. Space wolves and Thousand Suns pulled back, recognizing that this confrontation transcended their ability to influence. Magnus stood in his transformed state, psychic energy crackling around his form like visible lightning. Russ approached in his standard armor, the sword of Bale Knight drawn and ready. The contrast between them was stark. Magnus elevated to near godlike power through his connection to the warp, Russ relying on physical prowess and weapons forged through conventional means. Their combat was brief and devastating. Magnus struck first, unleashing psychic attacks that would have vaporized normal humans instantly. Russ weathered these assaults through sheer determination and the protective runes inscribed on his armor by his rune priests. The Wolf King closed the distance between them with supernatural speed, bringing his sword to bear against Magnus's transformed body. The Crimson King defended himself with barriers of solidified psychic energy and counterattacks that carved furrows in the plaza's stone floor. The two Primarchs traded blows that released energy sufficient to level buildings, their combat creating a localized storm of psychic and physical destruction. Russ exploited an opening in Magnus's defenses, a moment when the Crimson King's attention was divided between maintaining his transformed state and coordinating his legion's resistance. The Wolf King's blade penetrated Magnus's psychic barriers and struck home, carving through flesh that had been enhanced beyond normal Primarch durability. The wound was severe but not immediately fatal. Magnus retaliated with a psychic blast that sent Russ staggering backward, but the damage had been done. The Crimson King's concentration wavered, and his transformed state began to destabilize. Russ pressed his advantage with brutal efficiency. The Wolf King closed with Magnus again, grappling with his brother, and using his superior physical strength to force the Crimson King off balance. Russ lifted Magnus bodily, positioning his brother's spine across his armored knee. The Wolf King brought his full strength to bear, bending Magnus backward across that fulcrum point. The sound of the Crimson King's back breaking echoed across the plaza, a crack like thunder that momentarily silenced the surrounding battle. Magnus's psychic presence flickered and dimmed as agony overwhelmed his concentration. The Thousand Suns witnessed their Primarch's defeat with horror and desperation. Ahriman and the other senior officers recognized that the battle was lost, that continued resistance would result only in the Legion's complete annihilation. The chief librarian made the decision that Magnus, incapacitated by his injuries, could not make. Ahriman reached out through the warp, calling upon powers that the Thousand Suns had studied but never fully trusted. He opened himself to the entities that dwelled in the Immaterium, offering bargains and accepting prices that he did not fully understand in exchange for salvation. The response came from Tzeentch, the chaos god whose domain encompassed sorcery, change, and forbidden knowledge. The Architect of Fate had been watching the Thousand Suns for decades, recognizing in Magnus and his Legion potential servants of immense value. The destruction of Prospero presented an opportunity to claim these servants completely, to bind them through desperation and gratitude into eternal service. Tzeentch's power manifested across Tizca as reality itself began to warp and change. Rifts opened in the fabric of space, tears in reality that led not to the warp directly, but to a location that existed somewhere between real space and the immaterium. The planet of the sorcerers, Tzeentch's gift to his new servants, revealed itself through these rifts. The surviving 1,000 Suns felt compulsion drawing them toward these portals, psychic commands that overrode their conscious control. Warriors broke off from combat and ran toward the rifts, their forms dissolving into streams of energy as they passed through. Entire companies vanished in moments, pulled through the portals to safety and damnation in equal measure. Magnus himself was drawn through one of the larger rifts, his broken body lifted by invisible forces and carried toward salvation. The Crimson King's consciousness was fragmented by pain and the trauma of defeat, unable to resist or even fully comprehend what was happening. He passed through the rift and emerged on the planet of the sorcerers, a realm where the laws of physics bent to accommodate Tzeentch's whims. The surviving 1,000 Suns materialized around him, thousands of warriors who had escaped the destruction of Prospero, but who had paid a price they did not yet understand. The space wolves found themselves attacking empty air as their enemies vanished. Russ stood in the plaza where he had broken Magnus's back, staring at the space where his brother had been moments before. The Wolf King understood that the 1,000 Suns had escaped through sorcery, that Magnus had proven the very accusations that had led to Prospero's destruction. The victory was complete in military terms. The planet conquered and the 1,000 Suns scattered, but it tasted of ash. Russ had been denied the satisfaction of bringing Magnus to Terra in chains, had failed to fully execute the orders he believed he had received. Prospero burned for days after the battle concluded. The space wolves systematically destroyed everything of value, reducing the pyramids of Tizca to rubble and ensuring that no psychic lore or sorceress knowledge could be recovered from the ruins. The civilian population, those Prosperine scholars and citizens who had not been killed in the initial assault, were rounded up and dispersed to other worlds. The planet that had been humanity's greatest center of psychic learning was left a dead monument to the price of hubris and the Emperor's wrath. The 1,000 Suns, scattered to the planet of the sorcerers and bound to Tzeentch through their desperate escape, would never return to the world that had been their home. The planet of the sorcerers materialized around the surviving 1,000 Suns like a fevered dream made solid. Sorcerer, as it would come to be known, existed within the Eye of Terror, but occupied a space that defied conventional understanding of location or physics. The world was not simply a planet transported into the warp, but rather a manifestation of Tzeentch's given physical form, a realm where the architect of fate's domain intersected with real space sufficiently to provide stable ground beneath the feet of his new servants. The sky above churned with colors that had no names in human languages, hues that shifted and changed moment by moment as the warp currents that surrounded the planet ebbed and flowed. The landscape itself seemed uncertain of its own configuration, mountains rising and falling over the course of hours, rivers flowing uphill before reversing direction, forests of crystalline structures growing and dissolving according to patterns that suggested intelligence behind their formation. The 1,000 Suns who had been pulled through the rifts from burning Prospero found themselves scattered across this impossible terrain. Warriors materialized in groups ranging from single squads to entire companies, deposited at locations that bore no relationship to where they had entered the portals. The transition from real space to this warp-touched realm left the legionaries disoriented and struggling to comprehend their surroundings. Their armor's sensors provided readings that contradicted what their eyes perceived, instruments reporting atmospheric compositions and gravitational constants that should not have supported human life yet clearly did. The psychically sensitive members of the Legion felt the overwhelming presence of the warp pressing against their consciousness, a pressure that was simultaneously threatening and strangely welcoming. Magnus arrived on Sorcerer in a state of physical and spiritual devastation. The injuries Russ had inflicted during their confrontation had broken more than just the Crimson King's spine. The psychic backlash from maintaining his transformed state while sustaining such damage had further fragmented his already shattered soul. The Primarch's consciousness existed in pieces, some parts fully aware while others remained trapped in loops of memory or lost in the currents of the warp. His physical body bore wounds that would have killed any normal being instantly, vertebrae crushed and internal organs ruptured by the force of the Wolf King's attack. Only Magnus's nature as a Primarch and his immense psychic power kept him alive, his will refusing to allow death even as his body failed. The Thousand Suns found their Primarch in a crater that had not existed moments before his arrival. A depression in the crystalline ground that suggested his impact had been cushioned by forces beyond normal physics. Ahriman led the first group of legionaries to reach Magnus's location, the chief librarian having maintained enough awareness during the transition to track his Primarch's psychic signature. What Ahriman found horrified him. Magnus lay motionless, his crimson skin pale and his breathing shallow. The single great eye that had replaced his original two stared upward without focus, seeing visions that existed only in the warp or in the Primarch's fractured memories. Blood that seemed too bright, too red to be entirely natural, pooled beneath Magnus's broken form. The Thousand Suns apothecaries examined their Primarch with growing desperation. The injuries exceeded anything their training had prepared them to address. Primarch physiology was beyond even the advanced understanding that Space Marine apothecaries possessed, and the wounds Magnus had sustained involved not just physical trauma, but psychic damage that conventional medicine could not touch. The apothecaries stabilized what they could, using their equipment to support Magnus's failing organs and administering compounds that would have killed normal humans, but which Primarch biology could process. Yet they understood that these measures were temporary at best. Magnus required healing that transcended what Imperial medical science could provide. The answer came not from the Thousand Suns' efforts, but from Sorcerer itself. The planet responded to Magnus's presence, or more accurately, Tzeentch responded through the planet. The ground beneath the Primarch began to glow with light that cycled through impossible colors, and tendrils of pure warp energy emerged from the crystalline surface. These tendrils wrapped around Magnus's broken body with something that resembled tenderness, lifting him gently and beginning a process of transformation that the watching Thousand Suns could perceive but not fully comprehend. The apothecaries attempted to intervene, believing their Primarch was under attack, but Ahriman stopped them. The chief librarian recognized what was occurring even if he could not articulate it clearly. Magnus was being remade, his broken form reconstructed according to specifications that had nothing to do with the Emperor's original design. The transformation took days or weeks or months, time having lost coherent meaning on Sorcerer. The Thousand Suns established a perimeter around the crater where their Primarch underwent his metamorphosis, though what they were defending against remained unclear. No enemies appeared on this strange world, no threats materialized from the shifting landscape. Yet the legionaries maintained their vigil, watching as Magnus's form changed within the cocoon of warp energy that surrounded him. His body grew larger, exceeding even the considerable size he had possessed as a normal Primarch. His skin darkened from its original crimson to a deeper red that seemed to contain depths of shadow and flame. Wings began to emerge from his back, vast appendages that resembled those of some great bird, but which were formed from solidified warp energy rather than flesh and feather. Magnus's single eye underwent its own transformation, the organ expanding until it dominated his face, becoming a cyclopean feature that blazed with power drawn directly from the immaterium. The psychic presence that had always surrounded the Crimson King intensified beyond anything his sons had experienced before. Where Magnus's aura had once been powerful but controlled, something that could be perceived by psychers but which did not overwhelm them, his transformed presence was crushing in its intensity. Even non-psychers among the Thousand Suns could feel their Primarch's power as a physical pressure, a weight that pressed against their minds and threatened to drown their individual consciousness in the vast ocean of Magnus's enhanced awareness. When Magnus finally emerged from his transformation, the being that stood before the Thousand Suns was recognizably their Primarch, but fundamentally changed. He retained his intelligence and his memories, the core of his personality intact despite the physical and spiritual metamorphosis he had undergone. Yet he was no longer entirely the entity that the Emperor had created in the gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains. Magnus had become a demon Primarch, a creature that existed simultaneously in real space and the warp, His essence merged with the energies of chaos in ways that could not be undone. Tzeentch's mark was upon him, visible in the mutations that decorated his form, and in the way that reality itself seemed to bend slightly around his presence. The Crimson King addressed his legion for the first time since their arrival on Sorcerer, his voice carrying across the assembled warriors without need for technological amplification. Magnus spoke of what had been done to them, of the betrayal they had suffered at the hands of those they had called brothers. He described the Space Wolves' assault as an act of ignorance and fear, the Emperor's censure as a rejection of knowledge and enlightenment. The Primarch's words carried conviction born from genuine belief rather than cynical manipulation. Magnus had convinced himself that his actions had been justified, that his attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption had been the correct choice despite its catastrophic consequences. The punishment that had followed, the destruction of Prospero and the slaughter of his sons, represented not justice, but the Imperium's fundamental rejection of truth. This narrative provided the Thousand Sons with a framework for understanding their situation. They had been loyal servants of the Imperium, dedicated to the Great Crusade and the Emperor's vision of human unity. Their reward for this loyalty had been extermination, their homeworld burned and their knowledge destroyed by those who feared what they could not understand. Magnus's explanation offered his legion a way to process the trauma of their defeat and displacement. They were not traitors who had turned against the Imperium, but rather victims of the Imperium's betrayal, warriors who had been cast out for pursuing enlightenment that lesser minds found threatening. Yet even as Magnus rallied his legion and began organizing them for whatever future awaited on Sorcerer, the consequences of their escape from Prospero manifested in ways that none of them had anticipated. The bargain that Ahriman had struck with Tzeentch to save the Legion had come with prices that were only now becoming apparent. Individual Thousand Sons began experiencing mutations that recalled the flesh change that had plagued the Legion before Magnus's original bargain with the entity in the warp. Warriors would feel their armor growing tight as their bodies swelled and changed, limbs elongating, or additional appendages emerging from torsos. These transformations were not uniform, but rather seemed tailored to each individual, as though some intelligence was selecting mutations that reflected each warrior's nature or abilities. The psychically gifted members of the Legion suffered particularly severe mutations. Librarians who had been powerful psychers before the Legion's arrival on Sorcerer found their abilities amplifying uncontrollably, their connection to the warp deepening, until they could no longer fully distinguish between real space and the immaterium. Some welcomed these changes, viewing them as enhancements that made them more effective servants of their Primarch. Others struggled against the mutations, recognizing them as corruption that was eroding their humanity. The enumerations that had protected the Thousand Sons from the flesh change proved ineffective against these new transformations. The mental disciplines that Magnus had taught his legion could not contain changes that were being imposed from outside rather than emerging from within. Ahriman watched his battle brothers succumb to mutation with growing horror. The chief librarian had believed that the escape to Sorcerer represented salvation, a chance for the Legion to survive and eventually reclaim their honor. Instead, he saw his brothers transforming into creatures that bore little resemblance to the warriors they had been. The mutations were not simply physical, but affected the minds and souls of those afflicted. Warriors who had been rational and disciplined became erratic and unpredictable, their personalities warping along with their bodies. Some lost the ability to communicate coherently, their speech dissolving into streams of prophecy or madness. Others retained their intelligence, but became fixated on bizarre obsessions, pursuing goals that made sense only within frameworks of logic that had been twisted by warp exposure. The chief librarian consulted the texts and knowledge that the Thousand Sons had managed to preserve from Prospero's libraries. Small portions of the great repositories had been saved, either through foresight or accident, carried by legionaries who had grabbed what they could during the chaos of the Space Wolves' assault. These fragments represented a tiny fraction of what had been lost, but they contained enough information for Ahriman to begin researching potential solutions to the mutation crisis. He studied accounts of similar phenomena from other civilizations and time periods, examining how previous cultures had dealt with warp-induced changes. The texts offered no easy answers, but they suggested possibilities that Ahriman began to explore with desperate determination. Magnus was aware of the mutations spreading through his legion, but seemed strangely unconcerned by their progression. The demon Primarch had embraced his transformation and viewed his son's changes as natural consequences of their new existence. He spoke of mutation as evolution, of the alterations as enhancements that would make the Thousand Sons more effective servants of knowledge and enlightenment. This perspective horrified Ahriman, who recognized it as rationalization born from Magnus's own transformation. The Primarch, who had once been so careful about psychic safety, who had developed the enumerations specifically to protect his legion from warp-induced corruption, now dismissed those same concerns as limitations imposed by outdated thinking. Ahriman gathered those members of the Legion who shared his concerns, sorcerers and scholars who recognized the mutations as threats rather than gifts. This group included representatives from all 5 fellowships, warriors who had maintained their discipline and rationality despite the changes affecting their brothers. They met in secret, aware that Magnus would likely forbid what they were planning if he learned of it. The chief librarian proposed a radical solution to the mutation crisis, a working of sorcery on a scale that the Thousand Sons had never attempted. He called it the Rubric, a spell that would stabilize the Legion's gene seed and halt the mutations permanently by binding each warrior's essence to his armor through psychic means. The theoretical foundation for the Rubric drew on knowledge from multiple sources. Ahriman had studied Prosperine texts that described techniques for binding spirits to physical objects, methods that ancient sorcerers had used to create psychically active artifacts. He combined these principles with his understanding of space marine physiology and gene seed function, developing a formula that would theoretically lock each warrior's physical form in its current state, while preserving his consciousness and abilities. The spell would require immense amounts of psychic energy and would need to be cast simultaneously across the entire Legion to be effective. The risks were substantial, but Ahriman believed the alternative, allowing the mutations to continue unchecked until the Thousand Sons became mindless spawn, was unacceptable. The preparation for the Rubric took months of careful work. Ahriman and his collaborators refined the spell's structure, testing components on small scales and making adjustments based on the results. They gathered the materials that would serve as foci for the working, artifacts and components that could channel and direct the massive amounts of psychic energy the spell would require. The chief librarian knew that he was violating principles that Magnus had taught, that he was engaging in exactly the kind of reckless sorcery that had led to catastrophe before. Yet he convinced himself that the circumstances justified the risk, that saving the Legion from dissolution into chaos spawn was worth any price. The casting of the Rubric occurred during a period when Magnus had withdrawn into meditation, his consciousness projected into the deeper regions of the warp on some errand that he had not explained to his Legion. Ahriman seized this opportunity, gathering his collaborators and beginning the ritual that would reshape the Thousand Sons forever. The spell built slowly, psychic energy accumulating as the sorcerers chanted formulas and manipulated the warp currents that flowed through Sorshirius. The planet itself seemed to respond to the working, the landscape shifting and the impossible sky darkening as power gathered. The Thousand Sons who were not participating in the ritual felt the pressure building, a sensation of immense forces being constrained and directed towards some purpose they could not perceive. The Rubric's release came as a wave of psychic energy that washed across the entire Legion simultaneously. Every Thousand Son, regardless of their location on Sorshirius, felt the spell strike them. For those who possessed strong psychic abilities and had maintained their mental discipline, the Rubric stabilized their forms as Ahriman had intended. Their mutations ceased, their bodies locked into their current configurations with their minds and powers intact. These sorcerers would continue to serve as the Legion's leaders and specialists, their capabilities enhanced by their time on Sorshirius, but their essential nature preserved. For the majority of the Legion, however, the Rubric had catastrophically different effects. Warriors whose psychic potential was weaker, or whose minds had been damaged by mutation, found their physical bodies disintegrating as the spell struck them. flesh and bone dissolved into dust that drifted away on winds that existed only in the warp, leaving behind only their armor and the psychic echoes of their consciousness. These suits of armor remained animate, standing upright and capable of movement, but the warriors who had worn them were reduced to little more than ghosts bound to ceramite and plasteel. The Rubric Marines, as they became known, retained only fragments of their former personalities and capabilities. They could follow orders and fight with mechanical precision, but the thinking, feeling individuals they had been were gone. Ahriman stood among the results of his working with dawning horror. Thousands of his battle brothers had been reduced to animated armor, their souls trapped in a state between life and death. The chief librarian had intended to save the Legion from mutation, but had instead transformed most of its members into something arguably worse than chaos spawn. The Rubric Marines were stable and controllable, immune to further mutation, because they no longer possessed flesh that could change, but they were also hollow shells of what they had been. The Legion that Ahriman had sought to preserve had been destroyed just as surely as if he had done nothing, and allowed the mutations to run their course. Magnus returned from his meditations to find his Legion transformed. The demon Primarch's rage at what Ahriman had done was immediate and absolute. Magnus had accepted his own transformation, and the mutations affecting his sons as necessary consequences of their new existence, changes that would eventually stabilize into new forms of being. Ahriman's spell had short-circuited this process, imposing a solution that Magnus viewed as worse than the problem it addressed. The Crimson King saw the Rubric Marines as abominations, his sons reduced to automatons that retained only the appearance of life. That Ahriman had acted without permission, had undertaken this working while Magnus was absent, made the transgression even more unforgivable. The confrontation between Magnus and Ahriman took place in the crystalline wastes of Sorcerer, with the surviving sorcerers of the Legion assembled to witness their Primarch's judgment. Magnus's transformed form towered over his chief librarian, wings spread, an eye blazing with fury that was both personal and psychic. The demon Primarch condemned Ahriman's actions as arrogant presumption, as the same kind of hubris that Magnus himself had displayed when he broke the barriers protecting the Emperor's Webway project. The parallel was not lost on either of them. Ahriman had acted from desperation and good intentions, believing he knew better than his Primarch what the Legion needed, just as Magnus had once believed he knew better than the Emperor. The results had been similarly catastrophic. Magnus pronounced sentence upon Ahriman and those who had participated in the rubric's casting. They were to be exiled from the Legion, cast out to wander the Eye of Terror without the protection or support of their brothers. The exiles, as they became known, would be forbidden from returning to Sorcerer or communicating with the 1,000 sons who remained. This punishment was both mercy and cruelty. Magnus spared Ahriman's life despite the magnitude of his transgression, but condemned him to an existence of isolation and guilt, forever separated from the Legion he had sought to save. The other sorcerers who had participated in the rubric shared this fate, cast out alongside their leader to face whatever future awaited them in the warp-touched regions of the Eye of Terror. The 1,000 sons who remained on Sorcerer under Magnus's leadership were fundamentally changed from what they had been. The Legion now consisted of a small number of powerful sorcerers who had survived the rubric intact, supported by thousands of rubric marines who served as tireless but mindless infantry. The demon Primarch set about organizing this transformed force, establishing structures and hierarchies that would allow the Legion to function despite its altered composition. Magnus drew more deeply on Tzeentch's power to sustain his sons, binding them more completely to the Chaos God's service with each passing year. The 1,000 sons became tools of the Architect of Fate, serving purposes that often remained opaque even to Magnus himself. The transformation that Magnus underwent on Sorcerer fundamentally altered not just his physical form, but the very nature of his existence. As a demon Primarch, he occupies a unique position in the hierarchy of chaos, neither fully mortal nor entirely demonic. His essence remains anchored to real space through his origin as one of the Emperor's creations, yet he draws power directly from the warp and from Tzeentch specifically in ways that transcend what any mortal psyker could achieve. This dual nature grants Magnus capabilities that exceed what he possessed as a standard Primarch, while simultaneously binding him to the architect of fate's agenda in ways he cannot fully escape. Magnus's psychic abilities as a demon Primarch operate on a scale that makes his pre-transformation powers seem limited by comparison. Where he once needed to gather and channel warp energy through careful mental discipline and the enumerations, he now exists in a state of permanent connection to the immaterium. The boundaries between his consciousness and the warp have become permeable in ways that would destroy any lesser being. Magnus perceives multiple layers of reality simultaneously, seeing not just the physical world, but the currents of psychic energy that flow through and around it, the emotional resonances that living beings create, and the patterns of fate that Tzeentch weaves through causality itself. This multi-layered perception allows him to identify weaknesses and opportunities that remain invisible to others, to predict actions before they occur, and to manipulate events through interventions that appear minor but cascade into significant consequences. The Crimson King's mastery extends across all traditional psychic disciplines, without the limitations that constrain mortal practitioners. A human psyker typically specializes in one or two areas of psychic ability, their training and natural aptitude determining whether they excel at telepathy, telekinesis, pyromancy, or other specific applications. Magnus transcends these categories entirely. He can simultaneously project his consciousness across star systems to communicate telepathically with multiple recipients, manipulate physical objects with telekinetic force sufficient to crush tanks or topple buildings, ignite enemies with psychic fire that burns hotter than plasma, and reshape living tissue through biomantic techniques that exceed anything the Pavoni Fellowship developed on Prospero. These abilities flow together seamlessly, limited only by Magnus's attention and the tactical requirements of any given situation, rather than by inherent constraints on his power. Reality manipulation represents one of Magnus's most dangerous capabilities as a demon Primarch. The laws of physics that govern real space become suggestions rather than absolute rules in his presence. Magnus can alter local conditions to create environments that should be impossible according to natural law. He has been observed causing gravity to reverse in localized areas, sending enemy forces tumbling upward into the sky before releasing them to fall to their deaths. Temperature fluctuations occur at his whim, flash freezing entire squads of soldiers or superheating the air until exposed flesh blisters and burns. Time itself flows inconsistently near Magnus when he chooses to manipulate it, creating zones where seconds stretch into subjective hours for those trapped within while the rest of the battlefield proceeds normally. These reality distortions serve both offensive and defensive purposes, creating tactical advantages while disorienting and demoralizing enemies who find themselves fighting in conditions that violate their understanding of how the universe functions. The sorcery that Magnus practices as a demon Primarch differs fundamentally from the discipline's psychic techniques he taught the Thousand Sons on Prospero. Where his pre-transformation approach emphasized understanding and control, his current methods embrace the warp's chaotic nature while directing it through force of will and knowledge accumulated over millennia. Magnus can cast spells that require hours of preparation and complex ritual components, workings that reshape large-scale conditions or summon entities from the deepest regions of the immaterium. He also employs instant sorcery, manifesting effects through pure willpower in the midst of combat without need for preparation or material components. The versatility this provides makes Magnus unpredictable in engagement, capable of responding to threats with solutions drawn from an effectively unlimited arsenal of sorcerous techniques. Magnus's physical form as a demon Primarch reflects his transformation in ways that grant capabilities beyond what his original body possessed. His size fluctuates according to the amount of warp energy he channels into his physical manifestation. In his standard state, Magnus stands approximately twice the height of a normal space marine, his crimson skin marked with patterns that shift and change like living tattoos. These markings are not decorative but functional, serving as channels for warp energy that flows through his form constantly. When Magnus chooses to grow larger, drawing more deeply on Tzeentch's power, he can expand to truly titanic proportions. Accounts from battlefields where he has manifested describe the demon Primarch towering over Imperial Titans, his single great eye visible from kilometers away, as it blazes with power that illuminates the surrounding terrain. The wings that emerged during Magnus's transformation serve multiple purposes beyond their obvious visual impact. These appendages are formed from solidified warp energy rather than biological tissue, their structure more akin to psychic constructs than physical organs. They grant Magnus the ability to fly despite his massive size, defying conventional aerodynamics through direct manipulation of gravitational and inertial forces. The wings also function as additional limbs for combat purposes, their edges sharp enough to slice through ceramite armor, and their surface area sufficient to generate hurricane force winds when Magnus beats them. More subtly, the wings serve as psychic amplifiers, increasing the range and power of Magnus's sorceress abilities when fully extended. Demonic regeneration ensures that Magnus can recover from injuries that would permanently cripple or kill other beings. His physical form is not truly flesh in the conventional sense, but rather a manifestation of his essence given material shape through warp energy. Damage to this form repairs itself as Magnus channels power from the immaterium to restore the disrupted structure. Limbs severed in combat regrow within minutes. Wounds that penetrate deep into his torso seal and heal before significant blood loss occurs, and even his single great eye, if damaged, reconstructs itself from the warp energies that constantly flow through his being. This regeneration operates faster when Magnus is within the Eye of Terror or other regions where the warp's influence is strong, as the abundant psychic energy in such locations provides ready material for repairs. In real space, particularly in areas protected by Geller fields or blessed by the Emperor's servants, regeneration proceeds more slowly as Magnus must draw the necessary energy from greater distances. Conventional weapons prove largely useless against Magnus's demonic form. Bolter rounds that would shred normal flesh pass through his body with minimal effect, the wounds they create closing almost immediately. Plasma weapons and melta-guns cause more significant damage through the sheer thermal energy they deliver, but even these injuries heal within moments unless sustained fire prevents regeneration. Power weapons and force weapons wielded by skilled opponents can harm Magnus more effectively, particularly if the wielder possesses psychic abilities that allow them to disrupt the warp energies maintaining his physical form. However, few warriors possess the skill and power necessary to exploit these vulnerabilities before Magnus's counterattacks eliminate them. The most effective weapons against the demon Primarch are those specifically designed to harm warp entities or blessed by the Emperor's power, as these can disrupt his essence directly rather than merely damaging his physical manifestation. Magnus's command over demonic entities stems from his status as Tzeentch's chosen servant and his own immense psychic power. Lesser demons of the Architect of Fate respond to his summons with the same obedience they would show to direct commands from their patron god. Pink horrors manifest at Magnus's call, their cackling forms materializing from the warp to hurl gouts of multicolored flame at his enemies. When destroyed, these creatures split into blue horrors as their nature dictates, continuing to fight until nothing remains but dissipating warp energy. Flamers of Tzeentch appear in response to Magnus's will, their serpentine bodies hovering above the battlefield as they project streams of mutagenic fire that transforms victims into chaos spawn, or reduces them to ash depending on the intensity of the flames. Screamers of Tzeentch slice through the air at Magnus's direction, their razor-edged forms capable of shearing through armor and flesh with equal ease. The scale of demonic summoning that Magnus can accomplish exceeds what any mortal sorcerer could achieve. Where a powerful chaos sorcerer might summon dozens of demons through hours of ritual preparation, Magnus can call forth hundreds or thousands of entities with comparatively minimal effort. He has been recorded manifesting entire legions of horrors to overwhelm enemy positions, creating tides of demonic flesh that absorb enemy fire through sheer numbers while advancing inexorably forward. These mass summonings serve strategic purposes beyond simple combat effectiveness. The presence of so many demons in real space creates localized warp rifts, areas where the boundary between the materium and immaterium becomes thin enough that reality itself begins to break down. These rifts facilitate further demon manifestations and create environmental conditions that favor chaos forces while hindering imperial defenders. Greater demons respond to Magnus's summons as well, though these more powerful entities retain more autonomy than their lesser counterparts. Lords of Change, Tzeentch's greater demons, appear when Magnus calls them but negotiate the terms of their service rather than accepting orders blindly. These negotiations occur on psychic levels invisible to outside observers, Magnus and the greater demon exchanging concepts and promises in the span of heartbeats. The Lords of Change respect Magnus's power and position within Tzeentch's hierarchy, but they pursue their own agendas alongside whatever tasks the demon Primarch assigns them. This dynamic creates complexity in Magnus's command structure, as he must balance the capabilities that greater demons provide against the risk that they might interpret his instructions in ways that serve their purposes rather than his. Soul fragmentation, the condition that resulted from Magnus's attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, grants the demon Primarch capabilities that are unique even among his fellow demon princes. The shards of his essence that were scattered during the psychic backlash exist independently in the warp, each containing portions of Magnus's knowledge, memories, and power. These fragments allow Magnus to manifest in multiple locations simultaneously, each manifestation representing a different aspect of his personality and capabilities. One shard might appear on a battlefield leading Thousand Suns forces in direct combat, while another manifests in a distant star system to conduct sorcerous rituals, and a third projects itself into the materium to communicate with mortal servants. These multiple manifestations are not merely illusions or psychic projections, but genuine expressions of Magnus's essence, capable of independent action and decision, making within the parameters of their particular shard's nature. The fragmented state of Magnus's soul creates both advantages and vulnerabilities. The ability to act in multiple locations provides strategic flexibility that even other demon Primarchs lack. Magnus can coordinate operations across vast distances without relying on subordinates or risking the communication delays that plague conventional military forces. However, the fragmentation also means that Magnus is never operating at his full potential when manifested. Each shard contains only a portion of his total power and knowledge, making individual manifestations weaker than Magnus would be if his soul were whole. Enemies who understand this vulnerability have attempted to exploit it by destroying individual shards, hoping to permanently diminish the demon Primarch's capabilities. These efforts have met with limited success, as Magnus has proven capable of recovering and reintegrating destroyed shards over time, though the process requires significant effort and leaves him weakened while it proceeds. Precognition represents another area where Magnus's capabilities as a demon Primarch exceed what he could achieve in his original form. The Corvidi Fellowship on Prospero developed sophisticated techniques for perceiving possible futures, reading the branching paths of probability to predict likely outcomes. Magnus's precognitive abilities transcend these mortal methods entirely. He perceives the future not as a set of possibilities branching from present conditions, but as a vast web of interconnected events that Tzeentch weaves according to plans spanning millennia. This perception allows Magnus to identify not just what will happen, but why events unfold as they do, seeing the patterns and purposes behind apparently random occurrences. He uses this knowledge to position his forces optimally, to strike at moments when enemy defenses are weakest, and to avoid threats that would destroy lesser commanders who lack his foresight. The accuracy of Magnus's precognition varies depending on multiple factors. Events involving other powerful psychic entities, or those touched by the other chaos gods, become harder to predict clearly, as their influence creates interference in the patterns Magnus perceives. The Emperor's presence similarly obscures precognitive vision, his power creating zones of uncertainty that Magnus cannot penetrate reliably. Actions taken by individuals who possess strong willpower or who serve the anathema faithfully also prove harder to predict, as their choices introduce variables that resist deterministic forecasting. Despite these limitations, Magnus's precognitive capabilities provide enormous tactical and strategic advantages, allowing him to outmaneuver opponents who possess superior numbers or firepower but lack his ability to perceive future developments. Astral projection allows Magnus to separate his consciousness from his physical form and travel through the warp as pure psychic energy. This capability existed before his transformation, but has been enhanced by his demonic nature to the point where the distinction between his physical presence and psychic projection becomes largely academic. Magnus can project his awareness across the galaxy instantaneously, observing events on distant worlds or within enemy installations, without physically traveling to those locations. These projections are not mere passive observations, but allow Magnus to interact with his surroundings in limited ways. He can communicate with individuals through telepathy, manifest visible apparitions that terrify or demoralize enemies, and even channel sorceress energies through his projected form to affect physical reality at his target location. The ability to traverse the materium and immaterium at will provides Magnus with mobility that conventional forces cannot match or counter effectively. He can step from real space into the warp without need for spacecraft or warp-capable vessels, his demonic nature allowing him to exist in the immaterium without the protections that mortal beings require. This capability enables Magnus to appear on battlefields without warning, materializing from the warp directly into combat zones where his presence can turn the tide of engagement. He withdraws with equal facility when situations become unfavorable, vanishing into the immaterium before enemies can coordinate effective responses. Imperial forces facing Magnus must contend with an opponent who can strike anywhere at any time, who cannot be contained through conventional blockades or defensive positions, and who chooses the time and place of engagement according to his own strategic calculations. The extent of Magnus's power fluctuates based on his proximity to sources of warp energy and the strength of the barriers between real space and the immaterium. Within the Eye of Terror, where the warp and materium overlap extensively, Magnus operates at near maximum capability. His sorcery manifests with minimal effort, his physical form maintains itself effortlessly, and his connection to Tzeentch flows unimpeded. In real space, particularly in regions far from warp rifts or areas protected by Imperial saints or the Emperor's direct influence, Magnus's power diminishes noticeably. He must expend more energy to maintain his physical manifestation, his sorcery requires greater effort to cast, and his regeneration proceeds more slowly. These variations mean that Magnus carefully selects where and when he manifests in the materium, preferring to strike at locations where warp currents run strong, or where his servants have conducted rituals to thin the barriers between dimensions. The catastrophic psychic backlash that struck Magnus during his attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption did not merely wound him physically or spiritually in conventional terms. The force of the Emperor's wrath, combined with the destruction of the Webway Project's barriers and the tremendous energies Magnus had channeled for his sending, literally tore his soul apart. This fragmentation was not a metaphorical breaking of spirit or will, but an actual sundering of Magnus's essential being into discrete pieces that scattered across the warp in real space. Each fragment contained aspects of the Crimson King's personality, memories, knowledge, and power, but none possessed the totality of what Magnus had been before the shattering. The number of shards created in this catastrophe remains uncertain, with different sources suggesting anywhere from 9 to dozens of fragments, depending on how one counts the smaller splinters that broke away from major pieces. The fragmentation occurred across multiple dimensions simultaneously. In real space, Magnus's physical body on Prospero collapsed as his consciousness splintered, the psychic trauma manifesting as actual cracks that appeared in his flesh before his 1,000 suns stabilized him. In the warp, the structure of his soul, the psychic architecture that defined Magnus as a distinct entity, broke apart like glass struck by a hammer. The fragments flew outward along the currents of the immaterium, each piece carried by the tides of psychic energy that flow through that realm. Some shards remained relatively close to Prospero, lodging in nearby regions of the warp or manifesting on worlds within the same sector. Others traveled vast distances, ending up in locations scattered across the galaxy or lost in the deeper regions of the immaterium where even demons rarely venture. Each major fragment embodied specific aspects of Magnus's complex personality and capabilities. The Noble Shard, perhaps the most significant of these pieces, contained Magnus's loyalty to the Emperor, his genuine desire to serve humanity, and his original idealism about the Great Crusade's purpose. This fragment retained memories of Magnus's relationship with his father before the Council of Nicaea, the trust and understanding that had existed between them, and the hope that knowledge and enlightenment could elevate humanity to heights previously unimagined. The Noble Shard rejected the corruption that had claimed the rest of Magnus, maintaining the values and principles that the Crimson King had held before his transformation into a demon Primarch. Its existence proved that some portion of Magnus remained uncorrupted, that the being the Emperor had created still existed somewhere beneath the layers of demonic power and Tzeentchian influence. The Crimson King Shard represented Magnus's pride, his certainty in his own intellectual superiority, and his conviction that he understood the warp better than anyone else, including the Emperor. This fragment contained the arrogance that had led Magnus to violate the Edict of Nicaea, the hubris that convinced him his warning about Horus justified any action regardless of the Emperor's explicit commands. The Crimson King Shard embraced the transformation into a demon Primarch fully, viewing it as evolution rather than corruption, as transcendence beyond the limitations that bound lesser beings. This piece of Magnus's soul became the core around which his demonic form coalesced on Sorcerer, the foundation of the entity that now serves Tzeentch, while claiming to pursue knowledge and enlightenment. Other fragments represented different facets of Magnus's nature. One shard contained his scientific curiosity and methodical approach to understanding psychic phenomena, the part of him that had built the libraries of Tizca and systematized the study of the warp. Another embodied his role as teacher and mentor, holding memories of training the Thousand Suns and developing the enumerations that protected them from the flesh change. A third fragment carried his warrior nature, the tactical acumen and combat prowess that made him formidable even among his Primarch brothers. Each shard operated as a semi-independent entity, capable of thought and action within the parameters of its particular aspect of Magnus's personality, yet all remained connected through psychic bonds that linked them to the core consciousness that resided in the demon Primarch's form. The scattered nature of these fragments created immediate complications for Magnus after his transformation on Sorcerer. His power and knowledge, already diminished by the injuries Russ had inflicted, were further reduced by the absence of the shards that contained portions of his capabilities. The demon Primarch could access only what remained in his primary form, and the fragments that stayed close enough to maintain active connection. This limitation meant that Magnus operated at reduced capacity compared to what he could theoretically achieve if his soul were whole. Tasks that should have been trivial required significant effort, knowledge that he should have possessed remained frustratingly out of reach, and aspects of his personality seemed muted or absent entirely depending on which shards were currently integrated into his primary consciousness. Magnus became aware of his fragmented state gradually as he recovered from the initial transformation. The realization came not as sudden revelation, but as growing understanding that parts of himself were missing, that there were gaps in his memories and abilities that had not existed before. The demon Primarch could sense the scattered shards through the psychic bonds that connected them, perceiving their locations as distant presences in the warp or faint signals from real space. This awareness drove Magnus to begin the quest to recover his lost pieces, to reclaim the fragments and reintegrate them into his primary form. The task was complicated by the fact that the shards had scattered across vast distances and that some had been claimed or hidden by entities that recognized their value. The recovery of soul shards became an ongoing project that would span centuries. Magnus dispatched agents to search for fragments, sending Thousand Suns sorcerers and demon servants to investigate locations where he sensed the presence of his scattered pieces. Some shards were found relatively quickly, their psychic signatures strong enough to track despite the interference created by the warp's chaotic nature. These fragments were retrieved and brought back to Sorcerer, where Magnus performed rituals to reintegrate them into his primary consciousness. The process of reabsorption was neither simple nor painless. Each shard had existed independently for varying lengths of time, developing its own patterns of thought and behavior. Forcing these pieces back into unity with the primary consciousness required overcoming resistance from the fragments themselves and reconciling contradictions between what different shards had experienced during their separation. The noble shard proved particularly difficult to locate and recover. This fragment had fled far from Prospero when it separated from Magnus's primary consciousness, apparently driven by some instinct to distance itself from the corruption that claimed the rest. The noble shard manifested on various worlds across the Imperium over the centuries following the fragmentation, appearing to individuals in dreams or visions to warn them of chaos threats or to provide knowledge that helped them resist corruption. These manifestations were brief and limited, the fragment lacking sufficient power to maintain physical form for extended periods, but they created patterns that Magnus eventually learned to recognize. Each appearance left psychic traces that the demon Primarch's agents could follow, slowly narrowing down the noble shard's location through process of elimination. When Magnus finally cornered the noble shard, the confrontation revealed the depths of the division within his soul. The fragment refused reintegration voluntarily, rejecting the demon Primarch's claims that reunification would restore Magnus to his full power and capability. The noble shard argued that Magnus had fallen too far into corruption, that the being who sought to reclaim it was no longer the Primarch the Emperor had created, but rather a servant of chaos wearing Magnus's face. The fragment insisted that remaining separate, even diminished and incomplete, was preferable to being absorbed into an entity that served the ruinous powers. This resistance forced Magnus to pursue the noble shard across multiple star systems, attempting to capture it through sorcery and force rather than persuasion. The eventual fate of the noble shard remains subject to conflicting accounts. Some sources claim Magnus succeeded in recapturing and reintegrating this fragment, that the demon Primarch's power and cunning eventually overcame the shard's resistance. These accounts suggest that the noble shard's idealism and loyalty were twisted during the reintegration process, transformed into justifications for Magnus's service to Tzeentch rather than genuine opposition to chaos. Other sources maintain that the noble shard escaped permanently, that it remains hidden somewhere in the galaxy as the last uncorrupted piece of Magnus's original soul. These accounts point to occasional manifestations that occur in the 41st millennium, apparitions of Magnus appearing to Imperial psychers to provide warnings or guidance, as evidence that the noble shard continues to exist independently. Other fragments met various fates depending on where they landed and what forces claimed them. Some shards fell into the hands of other chaos entities who recognized their value and sought to exploit them. Demons of Tzeentch collected fragments they encountered in the warp, using them as components in sorceress workings or as bargaining chips in negotiations with Magnus. Chaos sorcerers who discovered shards in real space attempted to harness their power, incorporating them into artifacts or using them to enhance their own psychic abilities. These appropriations rarely ended well for those who attempted them. The fragments retained enough of Magnus's consciousness to resist being used as mere tools, and their power exceeded what most sorcerers could safely contain. Several recorded incidents describe chaos sorcerers being consumed or driven mad by shards they tried to exploit, the fragment's psychic energy overwhelming their minds and transforming them into mindless husks or chaos spawn. The Imperium occasionally encountered Magnus's soul shards without recognizing what they had found. Fragments that manifested in real space appeared as psychic phenomena that Imperial authorities typically classified as demonic manifestations or warp anomalies requiring immediate suppression. Inquisitors dispatched to investigate these occurrences found themselves facing entities that possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond normal demon activity, but which did not conform to standard patterns of chaos corruption. Some inquisitors concluded they were dealing with unique demon types, while others suspected they had encountered fragments of some greater entity without understanding the true nature of what they faced. The psychic signatures left by these manifestations occasionally drew the attention of the Grey Knights, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, who engaged the fragments in combat when they appeared on Imperial worlds. The reintegration of recovered shards affected Magnus's personality and capabilities in observable ways. Each fragment brought back aspects of his nature that had been absent or diminished, restoring knowledge and abilities that the demon Primarch had lost access to during their separation. However, the process also created internal conflicts as contradictory impulses and memories merged back into his primary consciousness. A shard that had spent centuries existing independently developed its own perspectives and priorities that did not always align with what the primary Magnus desired. The demon Primarch had to reconcile these differences internally, forcing unity through sheer willpower, while dealing with the psychological stress of containing multiple semi-independent aspects of his personality within a single consciousness. These internal conflicts manifested as inconsistencies in Magnus's behavior and decision-making. The demon Primarch would sometimes pursue goals that seemed to contradict his stated purposes, acting in ways that suggested different parts of his fragmented soul were influencing his choices at different times. During some encounters with Imperial forces, Magnus displayed the ruthless efficiency expected of a Chaos servant, destroying his enemies without hesitation or mercy. In other situations, he showed unexpected restraint or even provided warnings that allowed Imperial forces to escape situations they should not have survived. These inconsistencies confused both his allies and enemies, making Magnus unpredictable in ways that went beyond normal tactical deception. The fragmentation also affected Magnus's relationship with Tzeentch. The Architect of Fate had claimed Magnus as a servant through the demon Primarch's transformation on Sorcerer, binding him through the power that sustained his demonic form. However, the scattered shards represented portions of Magnus's soul that existed outside this binding, fragments that retained some measure of independence from Tzeentch's direct control. The Chaos God found this situation both amusing and useful, as the fragmented nature of Magnus's soul created opportunities for manipulation that would not exist if the demon Primarch's consciousness were unified and stable. Tzeentch could influence different shards in different ways, playing aspects of Magnus's personality against each other to ensure that the demon Primarch remained focused on pursuits that served the Architect of Fate's agenda. The quest to recover his scattered soul became one of Magnus's primary motivations in the millennia following his transformation. The demon Primarch understood that his effectiveness as a servant of Tzeentch and his ability to pursue his own goals were both limited by his fragmented state. Each recovered shard represented an increase in his power and a restoration of capabilities he had lost. Yet the process of recovery proved frustratingly slow and incomplete. Some shards remained beyond his reach, hidden in locations he could not access or protected by forces he could not overcome. Others were destroyed or corrupted beyond recovery, their essence dissipated or transformed so thoroughly that reintegration became impossible. The demon Primarch was forced to accept that he might never fully restore his original wholeness, that some portion of what he had been before the shattering was lost permanently. The existence of independent soul shards created strategic complications for both Magnus and his enemies. The fragments could act autonomously within the limits of their power and awareness, pursuing goals that the primary Magnus might not approve or even know about. These independent actions sometimes aligned with the demon Primarch's interests, as when a shard manipulated events to weaken Imperial defenses in a sector where Magnus planned to strike. Other times, the shard's activities worked against him, as when the noble shard provided warnings that allowed Imperial forces to prepare for attacks they should not have anticipated. The unpredictability this created made Magnus simultaneously more dangerous and more vulnerable than he would be with a unified consciousness. The fragmented state of Magnus's soul also provided his enemies with potential vulnerabilities to exploit. Imperial psychers and Grey Knights who studied the demon Primarch's nature theorized that destroying or capturing enough of his scattered shards might permanently weaken or even destroy him. These theories led to specialized operations aimed at locating and neutralizing soul fragments when they manifested in real space. The success rate of these operations remained low, as the shards proved difficult to track and even harder to contain or destroy permanently. However, each successful operation removed a piece of Magnus that could not be easily replaced, slowly eroding the totality of his power over centuries of attrition. The psychological impact of existing as a fragmented entity weighed on Magnus in ways that were not immediately apparent to outside observers. The demon Primarch maintained his characteristic arrogance and certainty in most interactions, presenting himself as supremely confident and in control. Yet internally, he struggled with the awareness that he was incomplete, that fundamental aspects of his nature existed beyond his direct access or control. This struggle created a persistent background tension in Magnus's consciousness, a sense of wrongness that he could never fully escape or resolve. The recovery of each shard provided temporary relief from this tension, but the knowledge that other fragments remained lost or inaccessible ensured that the psychological burden never disappeared entirely. The transformation into a demon Primarch did not diminish Magnus's appetite for warfare, but rather redirected it toward purposes that served both his own agenda and Tzeentch's incomprehensible schemes. The Crimson King's military campaigns following his ascension demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what he had possessed as a mortal Primarch, yet they also revealed the constraints that came with his demonic nature. Magnus could no longer simply deploy to a war zone and remain there indefinitely as he had during the Great Crusade. His manifestations in real space required constant expenditure of energy, and prolonged campaigns in regions distant from warp rifts or other sources of psychic power drained him in ways that conventional warfare never had. These limitations shaped his approach to military operations, favoring sudden strikes and devastating attacks over extended sieges or occupations. The Battle of the Fang represented Magnus's first major campaign after his transformation, a direct assault on Fenris that had been delayed for centuries by the need to rebuild the Thousand Suns and recover from the catastrophes that had befallen them. The attack occurred in the early 32nd millennium, approximately 1500 years after the burning of Prospero, a delay that demonstrated both Magnus's capacity for patient planning and the difficulties involved in organizing a campaign of sufficient scale to threaten a space marine homeworld. The demon Primarch had not forgotten what Leman Russ and the Space Wolves had done to his legion and his world. The memories of Tizca burning, of his sons being slaughtered while he had initially refused to resist, had festered within Magnus's consciousness throughout the intervening centuries. The attack on Fenris was not merely a military operation, but an act of revenge that Magnus had been planning since the moment he recovered enough strength to contemplate such an undertaking. The strategic situation in the early 32nd millennium favored Magnus's assault in ways that would not have been possible during the heresy itself. Leman Russ had disappeared decades earlier under circumstances that remained mysterious even to his own legion. The Wolf King had departed Fenris on what he described as a hunt into the Eye of Terror, taking his personal guard with him and leaving instructions that his sons should prepare for his eventual return. That return had not occurred, and the Space Wolves found themselves led by their senior officers rather than their Primarch. This absence created both tactical and psychological vulnerabilities that Magnus intended to exploit. The Space Wolves without Russ were still formidable warriors, but they lacked the supernatural leadership and combat capability that their Primarch had provided. Magnus gathered his forces on Sorcerer and in the surrounding regions of the Eye of Terror, assembling not just the Thousand Suns, but also demon legions and mortal cultist armies that had pledged themselves to his service. The fleet that eventually translated into the Fenris system numbered hundreds of vessels, a force comparable in scale to what the Space Wolves had brought to Prospero, but composed of ships that bore the marks of chaos, corruption, and warp-touched modifications. The hulls of Magnus's vessels were inscribed with sorcerous sigils that served both decorative and functional purposes, channeling psychic energy to enhance the ship's capabilities and protect them from conventional weapons. The fleet's appearance in orbit around Fenris triggered immediate alarm among the Space Wolves, who recognized the heraldry and markings as belonging to their ancient enemies. The Fang, the Space Wolves' fortress monastery carved into the mountains of Fenris's largest continent, represented one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Imperium. The structure extended deep into the mountain's core, with defensive positions and weapon emplacements covering every approach. Void shields protected the fortress from orbital bombardment, while anti-aircraft batteries and surface-to-orbit weapons threatened any vessels that approached too closely. The Space Wolves had spent the centuries since the heresy reinforcing these defenses, aware that enemies might seek revenge for actions taken during that conflict. The fortress contained supplies sufficient to withstand years of siege, and its garrison included not just space marines, but also mortal auxiliaries and defensive servitors that multiplied the effective combat strength available to the defenders. Magnus began his assault with sorcerous attacks rather than conventional bombardment. The demon Primarch manifested in real space above Fenris, his titanic form visible from the surface as he channeled immense amounts of warp energy toward the planet below. Psychic lightning arced from his outstretched hands, striking at the Fang's void shields and testing their resilience against supernatural assault. The shields held initially, their generators designed to repel both physical projectiles and energy weapons, but they had not been calibrated to resist the specific frequencies of psychic energy that Magnus employed. The demon Primarch adjusted his attacks methodically, probing for weaknesses in the shield configuration and exploiting them when found. Sections of the Void Shield network began to flicker and fail as Magnus's sorcery overloaded their generators, creating gaps in the defensive coverage that his fleet could exploit. Thousand Suns forces deployed to the surface through a combination of conventional drop pods and sorcerous teleportation. The Rubric Marines that now comprised the bulk of the Legion's infantry descended in perfect silence, their animated armor requiring no life support systems and feeling no fear or hesitation. These warriors advanced across Fenris's frozen wastes toward the Fang with mechanical precision, their bolters firing in coordinated volleys that demonstrated the tactical programming that guided their actions. The Thousand Suns sorcerers who accompanied them provided direction and psychic support, using their abilities to shield advancing units from enemy fire and to strike at Space Wolves' positions with devastating psychic attacks. The Space Wolves mounted fierce resistance from prepared defensive positions around the Fang's perimeter. Grey Hunters and Blood Claws held fortified bunkers and trench lines, their bolters and heavy weapons cutting down Rubric Marines by the dozens. The animated armor of the Thousand Suns infantry proved vulnerable to sustained fire, the ceramite eventually failing under repeated impacts to expose the emptiness within. Yet for every Rubric Marine destroyed, Magnus's sorcerers summoned demons to replace them, calling forth pink horrors and flamers that materialized directly behind Space Wolves' positions. The defenders found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, unable to establish stable defensive lines when enemies could appear anywhere through sorcerous means. Magnus personally led assaults against the Fang's most heavily defended sections, his demonic form smashing through fortifications that would have withstood Titan weapons. The demon Primarch's psychic attacks vaporized entire squads of Space Wolves, while his physical strength allowed him to tear through armored blast doors and collapse defensive structures. The Space Wolves who engaged Magnus directly discovered that their weapons were largely ineffective against his demonic nature. Bolter rounds passed through his form without causing lasting damage, and even power weapons wielded by Wolfguard veterans failed to inflict injuries that did not immediately regenerate. Only the chapter's rune priests proved capable of harming Magnus significantly, their psychic abilities allowing them to disrupt the warp energies that maintained his physical manifestation. The siege progressed through multiple phases over the course of several months. Magnus's forces penetrated the Fang's outer defenses and began fighting through the fortress's interior levels, advancing through corridors and chambers that the Space Wolves defended with suicidal determination. The fighting in these confined spaces favored neither side absolutely. The Thousand Suns' psychic abilities were constrained by the fortress's architecture, and by the presence of Space Wolves, rune priests who erected psychic barriers to limit sorceress attacks. The Space Wolves' close combat prowess gave them advantages in the brutal melee engagements that occurred when the two forces met in the fortress's halls, but the rubric Marines' immunity to fear and pain allowed them to fight with efficiency that matched the Space Wolves' ferocity. Magnus reached the inner sanctums of the Fang, penetrating to levels that had never been breached by enemies in the fortress's history. The Demon Primarch sought specific objectives beyond simple destruction, searching for artifacts and knowledge that the Space Wolves had accumulated over millennia. He located the Chamber of the Watch, where the Space Wolves maintained their records and chronicles, and ordered his sorcerers to copy everything they could before the defenders could destroy the contents. Magnus also sought Russ's personal quarters, hoping to find information about where his brother had gone and what the Wolf King had been seeking in the Eye of Terror. The search yielded limited results, as the Space Wolves had removed or destroyed anything of significant value before Magnus could reach these locations. The turning point in the siege came not from military action, but from the arrival of Space Wolves' reinforcements from across the Imperium. Multiple great companies that had been deployed to distant war zones received word of the attack on Fenris and began returning to defend their homeworld. These reinforcements arrived in scattered groups over several weeks, each adding to the defenders' strength and complicating Magnus's strategic calculations. The Demon Primarch recognized that he could not maintain his assault indefinitely against growing opposition. His manifestation in real space was already straining his capabilities, and the extended nature of the siege was depleting the warp energy reserves he had accumulated for the campaign. Magnus made the decision to withdraw before the siege could turn decisively against him. The Demon Primarch had achieved significant objectives despite failing to completely destroy the Fang. He had demonstrated that the Space Wolves' fortress could be breached, had inflicted casualties that would take the chapter decades to replace, and had recovered knowledge and artifacts that would prove useful in future operations. The withdrawal was conducted through mass sorceress teleportation, with Thousand Suns' forces vanishing from the Fang's corridors as Magnus opened rifts back to the Eye of Terror. The Space Wolves found themselves suddenly fighting empty air as their enemies disappeared, leaving behind only the destruction they had caused and the bodies of fallen warriors from both sides. The aftermath of the Battle of the Fang left the Space Wolves bloodied but unbroken. The fortress required extensive repairs, with entire sections having been destroyed or damaged beyond immediate use. The chapter's casualties included hundreds of battle brothers killed in action and thousands of mortal auxiliaries lost during the siege. Yet the Space Wolves had held their fortress against a Demon Primarch's direct assault, an achievement that few chapters could claim. Magnus departed Fenris with his revenge incomplete, aware that he had hurt his ancient enemies but had not destroyed them as he had hoped. The Demon Primarch would not forget this failure, and the Space Wolves understood that Magnus would return eventually to finish what he had started. The millennia following the Battle of the Fang saw Magnus involved in numerous smaller campaigns across the Imperium and within the Eye of Terror. The Demon Primarch led Thousand Suns' forces in raids against Imperial worlds, targeting locations that possessed libraries, research facilities, or artifacts of psychic significance. These operations were typically brief, with Magnus manifesting long enough to seize specific objectives before withdrawing back to the warp. The pattern suggested that the Demon Primarch was accumulating knowledge and resources for some larger purpose, though the nature of that purpose remained unclear to Imperial observers who studied his activities. Magnus's participation in the 13th Black Crusade demonstrated his willingness to cooperate with other Chaos forces when their goals aligned with his own interests. Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos and leader of the Black Legion, had been planning his assault on the Cadian Gate for centuries. the strategic importance of Cadia as the linchpin of Imperial defenses along the Eye of Terror's border made it a target that all the major Chaos powers supported attacking. Magnus contributed Thousand Sons forces to the crusade and provided sorceress support that proved crucial at several key moments during the campaign. The Demon Primarch's precognitive abilities allowed him to identify weaknesses in Imperial defensive deployments, while his command over demonic entities supplemented the conventional forces that Abaddon deployed. The fall of Cadia itself involved Magnus's direct intervention at critical junctures. The Demon Primarch manifested above the planet during the final stages of the assault, his psychic attacks targeting the pylons that had stabilized real space in the Cadian sector for millennia. These ancient structures, built by the Necrons in ages past, generated fields that prevented large-scale demon manifestations and kept the Eye of Terror from expanding beyond its current boundaries. Magnus understood that destroying these pylons would serve multiple purposes. It would eliminate a major obstacle to Chaos operations in the sector, would allow the Eye of Terror to expand and consume nearby star systems, and would demonstrate the futility of Imperial resistance against forces that could reshape reality itself. The destruction of the pylons required coordinated assaults by multiple Chaos forces, as the structures proved remarkably resilient against conventional weapons and even most sorceress attacks. Magnus worked alongside other Chaos sorcerers and demon princes, combining their powers to generate psychic assaults of sufficient magnitude to crack the pylons' defenses. The Demon Primarch's contribution was essential to these efforts, his knowledge of ancient technology and his raw psychic power allowing him to identify and exploit vulnerabilities that others could not perceive. When the final pylon fell, and the warp storms that had been contained by the pylon's fields began spreading across the sector, Magnus experienced satisfaction that transcended simple military victory. The fall of Cadia represented a fundamental change in the strategic balance between the Imperium and Chaos, opening possibilities for expansion and conquest that had been foreclosed for 10,000 years. The opening of the Great Rift and the beginning of the era Indomitus created opportunities for Magnus that he had not anticipated. The massive warp storm that split the galaxy in half generated psychic turbulence that affected every corner of the Imperium. The regions that became known as the Imperium Nihilus, cut off from Terra by the Rift, faced Chaos invasions without hope of reinforcement from the wider Imperium. Magnus directed Thousand Sons forces into these isolated sectors, targeting worlds that possessed knowledge or artifacts worth claiming. The Demon Primarch also pursued personal objectives in the Imperium Nihilus, searching for soul shards that he sensed had been carried into the region by the Rift's formation. The Wrath of Magnus campaign in late 41st millennium represented the Demon Primarch's return to Fenris, with forces sufficient to accomplish what he had failed to achieve during the Battle of the Fang. Magnus had spent the intervening millennia gathering power and planning his assault, waiting for conditions that would maximize his chances of success. The opening of the Great Rift provided those conditions, as the psychic energy flooding through the galaxy made it easier for Magnus to maintain his manifestation in real space and to channel the sorceress power necessary for large-scale operations. The Demon Primarch assembled a massive invasion force that included not just Thousand Sons, but also warbands from other traitor legions, demon legions loyal to Tzeentch, and mortal cultist armies drawn from worlds that had fallen to Chaos worship. The campaign began with an attack on Valdemani, one of Fenris's two moons. Magnus manifested above the moon and channeled psychic energy on a scale that dwarfed anything he had attempted during the Battle of the Fang. The Demon Primarch's sorcery struck at the moon's structure itself, creating earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that tore the satellite apart from within. The destruction was visible from Fenris's surface, the moon breaking into fragments that began falling toward the planet in a catastrophic bombardment. This display of power served multiple purposes beyond the immediate tactical advantage of eliminating Space Wolves' facilities on Valdemani. It demonstrated Magnus's capabilities to any who might resist, demoralized the defenders by showing them the futility of opposing such overwhelming force, and created environmental conditions on Fenris that would complicate Imperial relief efforts. The assault on Fenris itself proceeded with the 1,000 Suns deploying in overwhelming numbers across multiple landing sites. Magnus had learned from the Battle of the Fang, understanding that concentrated assaults allowed defenders to focus their strength against single points of attack. The dispersed deployment forced the Space Wolves to divide their forces, defending multiple locations simultaneously while lacking the numbers to adequately cover all threatened positions. The Demon Primarch manifested at the Fang once again, leading the assault on the fortress personally, while his subordinates prosecuted attacks elsewhere on the planet. The Space Wolves found themselves facing a more sophisticated opponent than had attacked them during the earlier siege. Magnus employed combined arms tactics that integrated rubric marine infantry, 1,000 Suns sorcerers, demon engines, and summoned demon legions into coordinated operations. The Demon Primarch's precognitive abilities allowed him to anticipate Space Wolves' counterattacks and position his forces to neutralize them before they could develop momentum. The psychic pressure that Magnus and his sorcerers generated across the battlefield disrupted Space Wolves' communications and coordination, forcing the defenders to fight as isolated units rather than as a unified chapter. The arrival of Primaris Space Marine reinforcements from the Indomitus Crusade prevented Magnus from achieving complete victory on Fenris. These new warriors, created using improved gene seed techniques developed by Archmagos Belisarius Call, possessed capabilities that exceeded standard Space Marines. Their enhanced physical attributes and superior equipment allowed them to engage 1,000 Suns forces more effectively than the defenders had managed previously. Magnus studied these Primaris Marines with interest during combat, perceiving the differences in their gene seed and noting the improvements that had been made to the original Primarch template. The Demon Primarch recognized that these warriors represented a significant enhancement to Imperial military capability, though he remained confident that they did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance between the Imperium and Chaos. The fighting on Fenris continued for months, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage, despite the enormous casualties being inflicted. Magnus maintained his manifestation through constant effort, drawing on warp energy that flowed more freely through the galaxy after the Great Rift's opening. The Space Wolves defended their homeworld with characteristic stubbornness, refusing to yield ground even when tactical withdrawal would have been the rational choice. The stalemate was eventually broken not by military action, but by the intervention of other Imperial forces that arrived to reinforce Fenris. The combined strength of these reinforcements exceeded what Magnus could effectively counter while maintaining operations across multiple fronts, forcing him to make the same calculation he had made during the Battle of the Fang. Magnus withdrew from Fenris again, pulling his forces back through warp rifts before the Imperial reinforcements could trap and destroy them. The Demon Primarch had inflicted tremendous damage on the Space Wolves and had demonstrated his ability to threaten even heavily defended Imperial positions, but he had not achieved the complete destruction of his ancient enemies that he sought. The Space Wolves remained a functioning chapter, bloodied and reduced, but still capable of military operations. Magnus departed with the knowledge that Fenris would require decades to recover from the devastation his assault had caused, a consolation prize that did not fully satisfy his desire for revenge, but which represented significant strategic achievement nonetheless. The 1,000 Suns Legion that exists in the current era bears little resemblance to the unified force that once prosecuted the Great Crusade under Magnus's command. The catastrophes that befell the Legion, from the burning of Prospero through Ahriman's rubric and the subsequent millennia of warfare in service to Chaos, have fragmented it into numerous warbands and factions that operate with varying degrees of independence. The organizational structure that Magnus established on Prospero, with its 5 fellowships and hierarchical command chains, has been replaced by a looser confederation of sorcerer-led groups that acknowledge Magnus as their gene father and spiritual leader, but which pursue their own agendas with considerable autonomy. This decentralization reflects both practical necessities imposed by operating within the Eye of Terror and the philosophical changes that have affected the Legion since its transformation. The core of the Thousand Suns remains based on Sorcerer, the planet of the sorcerers that Tzeentch gifted to Magnus following the Legion's escape from Prospero. This demon world serves as the closest thing the Legion possesses to a unified headquarters, though calling it such oversimplifies the reality of how the Thousand Suns operate. Sorcerer exists in a state of constant flux, its geography and even its fundamental physics changing according to patterns that reflect Tzeentch's whims and the psychic energies that flow through it. The sorcerers who maintain permanent presence on the planet have adapted to these conditions, establishing towers and sanctums that shift location but maintain their essential functions regardless of where they appear on the world's surface. These structures serve as bases for individual warbands, research facilities where sorcerers conduct experiments into the nature of the warp, and repositories for the knowledge that the Thousand Suns have accumulated since their fall. Magnus rules from Sorcerer when he chooses to manifest there, though the demon Primarch's attention frequently focuses on pursuits that take him far from the planet of the sorcerers. The Crimson King maintains a court of sorts, comprised of the most powerful sorcerers in the Legion and demon servants who attend to various administrative functions. This court lacks the formal structure that characterized imperial military organizations, operating instead through networks of personal loyalty, shared interests, and the respect that Magnus commands through his power and knowledge. The sorcerers who form this inner circle lead their own warbands and conduct their own operations, but they coordinate with Magnus when their goals align and defer to him when he takes direct interest in their activities. The cults of the Thousand Suns represent the primary organizational subdivision within the current Legion. These groups correspond roughly to the original fellowships that Magnus established on Prospero, though they have evolved significantly from those foundations. The Cult of Prophecy descends from the Corvidi Fellowship, maintaining the focus on divination and precognition that characterized their predecessors. These sorcerers specialize in reading the currents of fate and probability, using their abilities to identify opportunities for the Legion to exploit and threats to avoid. Their predictions guide many Thousand Suns operations, though the accuracy of their visions varies depending on factors that include the influence of other chaos gods, the presence of powerful psychers who can cloud the future, and the inherent uncertainty that Tzeentch introduces into all attempts to perceive what is to come. The Cult of Mutation evolved from the Pavoni Fellowship's biomantic traditions, but its practices have been corrupted by exposure to chaos into something that would horrify the original Pavoni masters. These sorcerers study the malleability of flesh and the ways that warp energy can reshape living tissue, conducting experiments that produce results ranging from useful enhancements to grotesque abominations. They maintain flesh-crafting laboratories on Sorcerer and aboard Thousand Suns vessels, facilities where they work on both volunteers and prisoners to explore the boundaries of what biomancy combined with chaos corruption can achieve. The Cult of Mutation provides the Legion with specialists who can heal injuries that would be fatal to normal space marines, enhance warriors with mutations that improve their combat effectiveness, and create biological weapons that spread warp-tainted plagues or transformations among enemy populations. The Cult of Time draws on the Corvidi tradition, but focuses specifically on temporal manipulation and the perception of events across different time periods. These sorcerers have developed techniques that allow them to perceive past and future simultaneously, to slow or accelerate time in localized areas, and occasionally to physically manifest in time periods other than their present. The practical applications of these abilities make the Cult of Time's members valuable assets in combat situations, as they can create zones where enemy forces experience time at different rates than the surrounding battlefield, effectively freezing opponents in place or causing them to age decades in seconds. The theoretical research that the Cult of Time conducts explores questions about the nature of causality and whether the past can be altered through sufficient application of psychic power, investigations that have produced results that even other Thousand Suns find disturbing. The Cult of Change maintains the Piri tradition of manipulating thermal energy, but has expanded its focus to encompass all forms of transformation and alteration. These sorcerers view change itself as sacred, believing that Tzeentch's fundamental nature manifests through constant mutation and evolution. They employ fire and energy manipulation in combat, as their predecessors did, but they also study broader applications of transformation, seeking to understand how matter and energy can be converted between different states through psychic means. The Cult of Change includes some of the Legion's most philosophically radical members, sorcerers who have embraced chaos corruption so completely that they view their original human nature as a limitation to be transcended rather than a heritage to be preserved. The Cult of Manipulation descends from the Athenian Fellowship's telepathic traditions, specializing in mental influence and the control of other beings' thoughts and actions. These sorcerers have refined their abilities beyond what the original Athenians practiced, developing techniques that can rewrite memories, implant false beliefs, and override an individual's will entirely. They serve as the Legion's specialists in infiltration and subversion, using their abilities to corrupt imperial officials, turn planetary populations against their rulers, and gather intelligence from sources who do not realize they are being manipulated. The ethical concerns that the original Athenians maintained about the proper use of telepathic abilities have been abandoned entirely, replaced by a pragmatic view that any technique that advances the Legion's goals is acceptable regardless of the harm it causes to those affected. The Cult of Scheming operates differently from the other cults, focusing on planning and coordination rather than specific psychic disciplines. These sorcerers serve as strategists and administrators, managing the logistics that allow Thousand Suns warbands to operate effectively and coordinating between different groups when large-scale operations require unified action. They maintain networks of contacts throughout the Eye of Terror and the Imperium, gathering intelligence about potential targets and opportunities. The Cult of Scheming also handles diplomatic relations with other chaos forces, negotiating alliances, and managing the complex political dynamics that exist among the various factions that serve the ruinous powers. Their work is less visible than that of the combat-focused cults, but it provides essential support that enables the Legion to function despite its fragmented nature. Beyond these organized cults, numerous smaller warbands operate under the Thousand Suns banner, without formal affiliation to any larger structure. These groups are typically led by individual sorcerers who command bands of rubric marines and whatever other forces they can gather. Some of these independent warbands pursue specific obsessions or research projects that their leaders have devoted themselves to, operating in isolation for decades or centuries before emerging to conduct raids that serve their particular purposes. Others function as mercenaries of sorts, offering their services to other chaos forces in exchange for resources, knowledge, or opportunities to acquire artifacts and texts that interest them. The autonomy these warbands enjoy reflects the reality that Magnus cannot and does not attempt to micromanage every Thousand Suns operation, trusting that his Gene Sons will generally act in ways that serve the Legion's broader interests even when operating independently. Ahriman and his exiles represent a significant faction within the broader Thousand Suns community despite their formal expulsion from the Legion. The Chief Librarian's quest to undo the damage caused by his rubric has driven him to conduct research and operations across the galaxy for millennia. He leads a warband composed of sorcerers who share his goals or who have been drawn to his cause through various circumstances. The exiles maintain no permanent base, operating from ships that travel through the warp and manifesting in real space only when their research or operational requirements demand it. Ahriman's relationship with Magnus remains complex and contradictory. The demon Primarch has never rescinded the sentence of exile that he pronounced after the rubric's casting, yet he has also never actively hunted Ahriman or attempted to prevent the Chief Librarian from pursuing his goals. The two occasionally cooperate when their interests align, communicating through intermediaries or psychic projection rather than meeting face to face. The exile's activities focus primarily on gathering knowledge and artifacts that might provide solutions to the rubric's effects. Ahriman has spent millennia searching for texts that describe techniques for separating souls from physical anchors, for methods of restoring consciousness to beings who have been reduced to psychic echoes, and for any information that might explain how to reverse warp-induced transformations. This quest has taken him to forgotten libraries on dead worlds, into the Black Library of the Eldari, where he fought past its guardians to access forbidden texts, and through regions of the warp where even demons rarely venture. The knowledge Ahriman has accumulated makes him one of the most learned sorcerers in the galaxy, though the solutions he seeks continue to elude him despite centuries of research and experimentation. The relationship between the exiles and the rest of the Thousand Sons varies depending on which specific warband or cult is involved. Some groups view Ahriman with hostility, seeing him as a traitor who destroyed the Legion through his arrogance, and who continues to compound his crimes by refusing to accept Magnus's judgment. Others maintain cordial or even cooperative relationships with the exiles, recognizing Ahriman's knowledge and capabilities as valuable assets that can be leveraged when circumstances permit. The chief librarian himself maintains a pragmatic approach to these relationships, willing to work with any Thousand Sons faction, when doing so advances his goals, but never allowing cooperation to develop into permanent alliances that might compromise his independence. Magnus's relationship with Tzeentch defines much of how the Thousand Sons operate in the current era. The demon Primarch exists in a state of permanent service to the Architect of Fate, bound by the transformation that saved him on Sorshirius, and by the continued support that Tzeentch provides to sustain his demonic form. Yet Magnus retains more independence than most demon princes or other servants of chaos gods typically possess. His intelligence and willpower allow him to pursue agendas that serve his own interests alongside whatever purposes Tzeentch intends him to fulfill. This independence manifests as Magnus conducting research and operations that have no obvious connection to Tzeentch's schemes, pursuing knowledge for its own sake, or seeking revenge against enemies who wronged him millennia ago. The Chaos God permits this autonomy, either because Magnus's independent actions ultimately serve purposes that Tzeentch has foreseen, or because the Architect of Fate finds entertainment in watching his servant struggle against the constraints of his service. The nature of Magnus's service to Tzeentch creates philosophical tensions that the demon Primarch has never fully resolved. He continues to view himself as a seeker of knowledge and enlightenment, maintaining the identity he held on Prospero despite the obvious corruption that has claimed him. Magnus rationalizes his service to chaos as a necessary accommodation to circumstances beyond his control, arguing that his transformation was forced upon him by the Imperium's betrayal rather than chosen freely. This narrative allows him to preserve some sense of his original purpose and values, though it requires ignoring or reinterpreting evidence of how thoroughly he has been corrupted. The Thousand Sons who serve under Magnus generally accept this rationalization, finding it more comfortable to believe they serve knowledge and enlightenment, rather than acknowledging that they have become tools of a chaos god, whose nature is fundamentally incompatible with genuine understanding. The tragic irony of Magnus's fate becomes more apparent with each passing millennium. The Primarch who sought to elevate humanity through mastery of psychic power has become a demon prince whose very existence depends on the same warp energies he once believed could be safely controlled through knowledge and discipline. His quest for understanding has led him into service to a being whose nature is deception and whose schemes are designed to be incomprehensible. The knowledge Magnus has accumulated over 10,000 years exceeds what any mortal scholar could achieve, yet it has not brought him closer to the enlightenment he sought on Prospero. Instead, each new discovery seems to reveal further complexities and contradictions, suggesting that complete understanding remains forever beyond reach regardless of how much information one accumulates. Magnus's original goal of serving humanity has been inverted into its opposite. The demon Primarch who once fought to protect human worlds during the Great Crusade now leads attacks against those same worlds, bringing destruction and corruption wherever his forces manifest. The libraries and research facilities he targets are not preserved for study, but plundered for specific texts and artifacts before being destroyed, denying the Imperium access to knowledge that might help it resist chaos. The Psyker's Magnus encounters are not trained and guided towards safe practice, but are corrupted and recruited into service to Tzeentch, their abilities turned against the Imperium they might once have defended. Every action Magnus takes serves to weaken humanity rather than strengthen it, regardless of how he frames his motivations to himself and his followers. The Scholar King, who ruled Prospero with wisdom and benevolence, has become a warlord who commands through power and fear. Magnus's interactions with his legion lack the mentorship and genuine concern for his son's welfare that characterized his leadership before the fall. The demon Primarch views the 1,000 Sons as tools to be deployed in pursuit of his goals, rather than as individuals worthy of care and development. His response to Ahriman's rubric demonstrated this shift clearly, as Magnus condemned his chief librarian for attempting to save the Legion, rather than recognizing the desperate circumstances that motivated the action. The transformation from teacher to tyrant reflects the corruption that has claimed Magnus's personality, along with his physical form, eroding the qualities that once made him admirable even as it enhanced his raw power. Yet fragments of Magnus's original nature persist despite the corruption that has claimed him. The Demon Primarch continues to value knowledge genuinely, pursuing understanding for reasons that go beyond mere tactical advantage or service to Tzeentch. His libraries on Sorcearius contain texts on subjects that have no obvious military or sorceress applications, accumulated because Magnus remains intellectually curious about topics ranging from xenobiology to abstract mathematics. He occasionally provides warnings or assistance to Imperial forces when doing so serves no apparent purpose, actions that suggest some part of him retains loyalty to humanity despite his service to chaos. These glimpses of his former self create confusion among those who study Magnus, raising questions about whether redemption might be possible or whether these behaviors represent nothing more than nostalgia for what he once was. The Space Wolves remain Magnus's eternal enemies, the focus of hatred that has burned undiminished for 10,000 years. Every encounter between the 1,000 Sons and the 6th Legion reignites the conflict that began with the burning of Prospero, both sides fighting with intensity that exceeds normal battlefield animosity. The Space Wolves view Magnus as the embodiment of everything they warned against at Nicaea, living proof that Psykers cannot be trusted regardless of their training or intentions. Magnus sees the Space Wolves as hypocrites who employ rune priests while condemning the 1,000 Sons for practicing sorcery, as executioners who destroyed Prospero on flawed orders without questioning whether their actions were just. Neither side has forgiven or forgotten what occurred during the heresy, and neither shows any inclination toward reconciliation. The feud will continue until one side or the other is destroyed completely, a prospect that seems unlikely given the resilience both forces have demonstrated over the millennia. The opening of the Great Rift and the beginning of the Era Indomitus has provided Magnus with opportunities he has exploited aggressively. The massive warp storm that splits the galaxy creates conditions where his demonic nature operates at maximum effectiveness, where the barriers between real space and the immaterium are thin enough that maintaining his manifestation requires minimal effort. The Demon Primarch has led multiple major campaigns since the Rift's opening, striking at targets throughout both the Imperium Nihilus and the regions that remain connected to Terra. His forces have grown as warbands that were scattered across the Eye of Terror have rallied to his banner, recognizing that the current strategic situation favors aggressive action. The 1,000 Sons pose a greater threat to the Imperium now than at any point since the heresy, their capabilities enhanced by millennia of experience and by the favorable conditions that the Great Rift has created. Magnus's ultimate goals remain obscure even to those who serve him most closely. The Demon Primarch pursues multiple agendas simultaneously, some of which appear to contradict each other when viewed from outside his perspective. He seeks to recover the scattered fragments of his soul, to accumulate knowledge and artifacts from across the galaxy, to take revenge on enemies who wronged him millennia ago, and to serve Tzeentch's incomprehensible schemes. Whether these various pursuits represent components of some master plan that Magnus has been developing for 10,000 years, or whether they reflect the fragmented nature of his consciousness and the competing impulses that drive him, remains unclear. The Crimson King offers no explanations to those who question his decisions, maintaining the air of mystery and superior understanding that has characterized him since his days on Prospero. The legacy Magnus leaves on the 41st and 42nd millennia extends beyond his direct military actions. His fall has shaped imperial policy toward psychers and the use of psychic powers in ways that persist to the present day. The Edict of Nicaea's restrictions were eventually modified as the Imperium recognized that completely prohibiting organized psychic warfare was impractical, but the cautious approach that the edict represented continues to influence how psychers are trained and deployed. The Thousand Sons corruption serves as a warning example cited by those who advocate for strict controls on psychic practice, proof that even the most disciplined and knowledgeable psychers can fall to chaos if they pursue forbidden knowledge too aggressively. Every Imperial psycher learns about Magnus and the Thousand Sons during their training, studying their fall as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the limits of human understanding when confronting the warp. The Thousand Sons themselves represent a permanent threat that the Imperium must allocate resources to counter. Entire sectors maintain dedicated forces prepared to respond to Thousand Sons incursions, while the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus tracks the Legion's activities and attempts to predict where they will strike next. The Grey Knights, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, have fought the Thousand Sons countless times over the millennia, developing specialized tactics and equipment designed to counter sorcery and demon summoning. These preparations consume resources that might otherwise be deployed against other threats, representing a continuing cost that Magnus's existence imposes on the Imperium even when he is not actively conducting operations. Magnus the Red endures as one of the Imperium's most dangerous enemies, a demon Primarch whose intelligence and power make him a threat that cannot be ignored or dismissed. The Scholar King, who once sought only to serve humanity and advance human knowledge, has become a servant of chaos, whose actions bring corruption and destruction wherever he manifests. Yet the echoes of what Magnus was before his fall continue to resonate through his current existence, creating a figure who remains tragic despite his monstrous nature. The Crimson King stands as a warning about the dangers of pride and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, a monument to the catastrophic consequences that can result when even the most gifted individuals convince themselves that they know better than those who seek to guide and restrain them. His story is one of potential squandered, of gifts turned to corruption, and of the terrible price that comes from trafficking with powers that cannot be fully understood or controlled regardless of one's intelligence or determination.